She had 30 seconds left before they took her children. Not a metaphor, not a warning. A government man in a gray coat was already unfolding the separation papers, his pen uncapped, his face bored. Like splitting a mother from 7 children was just another Tuesday in Red Hollow. Martha Whitlock stood on that wooden platform in the freezing wind, and every man in the crowd had already turned his back on her. Too big, too many mouths, too much trouble. But one man hadn't moved, a stranger in a black coat at the edge of the crowd, still watching. If this story has you leaning forward already, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The cold came in off the mountains like it had a grievance. It wasn't the polite kind of cold that makes people pull their collars up and walk a little faster. It was the kind that settled into your bones and made itself at home. The kind that Red Hollow had been living under for 3 weeks straight, ever since the first real snow of the season buried the pass roads and turned the whole territory into something that felt less like a place people chose to live and more like a place people got trapped in. Martha Whitlock had been standing on the auction platform for 47 minutes. She knew because she'd been counting. Not from any particular method. She didn't have a pocket watch, hadn't owned one in years, not since Thomas sold it to cover the seed debt the spring before he died, but she'd been counting the way desperate people count things when the alternative is thinking too clearly about what's happening to them. The platform itself was nothing impressive. 6 feet off the ground, rough-hewn pine boards that hadn't been sanded in years, a single railing along the back that leaned slightly to the left. The county used it for public announcements, for the occasional livestock sale when the regular pen flooded, and twice a year for what the government paperwork called a domestic settlement arrangement, and what everyone in Red Hollow simply called the auction. Martha stood near the front edge of it in her best dress, which was a dark green wool that had been her mother's, and which fit her the way clothes fit a person who'd had 7 children, and not enough to eat for the better part of 2 years. Awkwardly, in places that couldn't be hidden, straining at the seams across her back and hips, loose and shapeless everywhere else. She'd let the hem out twice already. She'd ironed it the night before until her arm ached. She was 34 years old, and she looked, she suspected, considerably older. Her hair was brown shot through with gray that had come in all at once the winter Thomas died, pinned back in the only style she knew how to manage without a mirror, which meant it was mostly under control with a few stubborn pieces escaping near her temples. Her face was wide and honest-looking, the kind of face that people tended to trust on instinct, though that quality hadn't done her a lick of good this morning. Below the platform, in the frozen mud of Red Hollow's main street, her children stood in a line. She told them to stand straight and look presentable. They were trying. She could see it from up here. Henry, the oldest at 14, with his jaw locked so tight he was probably giving himself a headache. Clara at 12, holding little Bess's hand even though Clara's knuckles were white. The twins, James and Joseph, standing so close together they were nearly one person. Annie at 6, who kept forgetting to stop fidgeting and then catching herself and going rigid again. And at the end of the line, Tobias. Tobias was 4 years old. He was wearing a coat 2 sizes too large, a hand-me-down from James, and he didn't understand what was happening today, but he understood that his mother was up on the platform and that he was not allowed to go to her, and that understanding was slowly dismantling him. She could see his face from here. She could see the way it was working. "Don't you cry, Toby. Not right now, sweetheart. Hold on just a little longer." The county official, a man named Aldridge, who wore a wool coat with a fur collar that cost more than Martha's entire farm had been worth, stood to her left on the platform with a clipboard and an expression of bureaucratic patience that was somehow more insulting than open contempt. "Mrs. Whitlock." He said her name the way people say the name of a town they've never been to and don't intend to visit. "We've now had 42 eligible men pass review, and as you know, the arrangement requires a willing party to complete. The settlement period closes at noon." "I know when it closes." "Yes. Well." He made a small sound that wasn't quite a sigh and wasn't quite a cough. "It is now 11:17. It's 43 minutes. Martha didn't say anything. She'd stopped responding to Aldridge about 20 minutes ago when she'd realized that his particular brand of officialness required acknowledgement to continue, and that if she gave him nothing, he eventually went quiet and stood there looking at his clipboard like it might say something useful. Down in the crowd, a man she didn't recognize leaned toward his neighbor and said something she couldn't hear. Both of them laughed. She didn't look at them directly. She'd learned early this morning not to look directly at the people laughing. There had been 42 men. The first 7 or 8, she'd stood up straight and met their eyes and answered their questions with as much dignity as she could manage. She told them about the farm, what was left of it, which wasn't much, but the land was still in her name. She told them about the children, their ages, their temperaments, what they were good at. Henry could handle horses. Clara had a gift for figures. The twins were strong for their age. The men had looked at her, and then they'd looked at the children, and one by one they'd stepped back or shaken their heads, or simply walked away without bothering to say anything at all. By the 20th man, she'd stopped volunteering information and just answered what they asked. By the 30th, she'd started focusing on a point somewhere above the crowd's heads, a gap between 2 storefronts where she could see a strip of pale winter sky. And she'd talk to that gap instead of to the men, because the gap didn't look at her the way they did. By the 40th, she'd stopped feeling her feet. She wasn't sure when the cold had done that, or whether the cold was entirely responsible. The 43rd man had been a farmer named Garrett, who smelled of tobacco and spent the better part of 5 minutes looking her up and down like he was assessing livestock at a county fair. He hadn't been unkind, exactly. He'd just been thoroughly, completely honest about his calculations. 7 children, he said, more to himself than to her. 7. He shook his head. I'm a fair man, Mrs. Whitlock, so I'll tell you plain. 3 maybe I could manage, 4 at a stretch, but 7. He clicked his tongue against his teeth. 7's not a family, that's a whole enterprise, and you'd need... He glanced at her, then away. A woman your size eats more than I'm... Thank you, Martha said, very quietly, for your honesty. Garrett had the decency to look uncomfortable. He nodded and stepped back. That was 18 minutes ago. Since then, the crowd had thinned somewhat. The serious buyers, men who'd actually come looking for a wife, had mostly made their decisions and moved on. What remained was a rougher audience, men who'd come for the spectacle of it, or who had nothing better to do on a Wednesday morning, or who simply enjoyed the particular cruelty of watching a desperate woman run out of options in public. They weren't entirely silent about it. Somebody ought to take her just for the free farm, one man said from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. A few people laughed. Free farm ain't worth 7 mouths, someone else answered. You'd need to be half out of your mind. Or all the way blind. More laughter. Martha kept her eyes on the strip of sky between the buildings. The pale winter light up there was clean and impartial and didn't think anything about her at all. Aldridge cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitlock, I want to make certain you understand the procedure should no arrangement be completed by noon. I understand it. The children would be transported to... I said I understand it, Mr. Aldridge. Her voice came out very flat, very steady. She was proud of that. She'd practiced it. Not the words specifically, but the tone. The way of speaking that took everything churning around inside her chest and pressed it down somewhere deep and locked it there. The children would be transported to the county facility in Pemberton, 60 miles north. Siblings could not be guaranteed to remain together. The facility didn't have capacity for family placement. Henry was old enough that he'd likely be assigned to a labor arrangement. Clara might be placed in service somewhere. The twins, the little ones, she didn't let herself think past that point because she'd made herself a rule against thinking past that point, or she wouldn't be able to keep standing on this platform at all. Down in the street, Tobias had started crying. He was doing it silently, in the way of small children who've been told not to make noise, tears just streaming down his face, his mouth pressed closed. Henry had moved to stand beside him and put a hand on his shoulder. Martha looked at the sky. She almost didn't see him. He was standing at the far edge of the crowd, near the side of Calloway's hardware store, and unlike most of the men who'd come this morning, he wasn't positioned to watch the platform. He was positioned sideways, leaning against the building's corner with his arms crossed, like he'd stopped here by accident or was waiting for something else entirely. He was large. That registered first, not in the dramatic way of stage villains or fighters, but in the quiet, structural way of a man who'd spent years doing physical work in a serious climate. Wide through the shoulders, heavy in the chest, with the kind of build that didn't look intentional, just accumulated. His coat was black wool, heavy, trail-worn, with a collar that he'd turned up against the wind. His hat was dark and pulled low. His face was... She couldn't fully read it from here. She got the impression of a beard, a strong jaw, eyes that were watching the platform in a way that was different from how everyone else was watching it. Most people were watching her. This man, she gradually realized, was watching the children, not in a threatening way, not in any way she could put language to immediately. He was simply looking at them with an expression that was careful, maybe, deliberate, like he was doing arithmetic. Martha noticed him the way you notice a sound in a quiet house. Not immediately, but once you do, you can't unnotice it. She looked away, looked back. He hadn't moved. Aldridge was speaking again. Given the time constraints, if any final parties wish to approach the review table, I'll approach. The voice came from the edge of the crowd. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There was something in the quality of it, low and level and entirely unhurried, that cut through the ambient noise of the crowd the way a stone cuts water. People stepped aside without seeming to notice they were doing it, just moved out of the path between that voice and the platform. The man in the black coat walked forward. The crowd got quiet, not the polite quiet of attention. The specific, tighter quiet of a group of people who've just recognized someone and aren't entirely sure what to do with that recognition. Martha watched him come. He walked the way certain men walk, not carefully, not with any particular showmanship, just with the absolute confidence of someone who'd never in his adult life needed to wonder whether he'd be allowed to go where he was going. He stepped up to the review table where Aldridge's assistant sat with the paperwork, and he looked down at the man behind the table, and the man behind the table sat up noticeably straighter. "Name," the assistant said, then immediately seemed to feel that the word had come out wrong and cleared his throat. Crow. Silas Crow. The murmur that moved through the crowd was low and fast, like a fire catching. Martha heard people repeating the name, some of them surprised, some uncertain, a few clearly uncomfortable. She didn't know why. She'd never heard the name before. Aldridge had gone very still on the platform beside her. The man, Silas Crow, answered the assistant's procedural questions without looking at the paperwork. Age, 38. Status, widower. Property, mountain ranch, Crow Valley, established 12 years prior. Livestock, significant, apparently. The assistant's eyebrows moved when the number was given. Land acreage, enough that the assistant repeated it back to confirm he'd written it correctly. Silas Crow said yes both times, without particular emphasis, the way someone confirms directions to a place they've been 100 times. Then he turned from the table and looked up at the platform. At her. Martha had made a rule about meeting the eyes of the men who came to assess her today. She'd broken it for maybe the first 15 and then stopped. She broke it now without deciding to. She just looked back at him. His eyes were dark brown or possibly black, hard to say in the flat winter light. His face was younger than his build suggested, maybe, or older in the wrong places. The beard was close-cropped, which was unusual for a mountain man. There was a scar across the left side of his jaw, thin and old, the kind that didn't come from anything accidental. He studied her with an expression she couldn't place, not appraising exactly, more like confirming something. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said. Still that same level voice. "I'd like to speak with you directly if the procedure allows." Aldridge, who had apparently collected himself during the paperwork process, said, "The arrangement structure requires that—" "I wasn't asking about the arrangement structure." Silas looked at Aldridge briefly, and Aldridge stopped talking. Then he looked back at Martha. "I'm asking you." Martha had not been asked anything all morning that treated her like a person with authority over her own situation. The question caught her so off guard that she nearly said the wrong thing. "The procedure allows it," she said. He walked around to the steps at the side of the platform and came up onto it. He was even larger up close, nearly a foot taller than her, which wasn't nothing, because she wasn't a small woman. He stopped at a respectful distance, which was something the other men today hadn't bothered with. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You've had a long morning," he said finally. It wasn't a question or a pleasantry, just an observation, stated plainly. "I have," she said. "Your children—" He glanced down at them briefly. 7. "Yes." "Ages?" She gave them to him straight, no embellishment. He listened without interrupting. "Henry's old enough to be useful," she added, "and Clara's—" "I didn't ask about useful," he said. Not unkindly, just clarifying. "I asked their ages." She stopped. looked at him. I have a working ranch, he said. 300 acres in the valley. Cattle, horses, timber. A house that's a house. It's adequate. Room for... He paused, seemed to be doing his own arithmetic. It can be made to work. Mr. Crow, I'm not a sociable man, he said. I want to tell you that plainly because I've been told it's a significant liability. I don't have much use for town, or for company generally, or for conversations that don't have a point to them. He said this with absolute zero apology in his voice, which she found strangely reassuring. I run my ranch. I work it myself, mostly, with 2 hired men in season. I don't gamble, I don't drink to excess, and I've never in my life raised a hand to a woman or a child. Martha studied his face. Why are you here? He seemed to find the question reasonable. He thought about it for a moment. My ranch needs more than 2 hands can manage, he said. I need a capable partner, and I've known for 2 years I need one. I've avoided this process because... A brief pause. The process has not impressed me. Until this morning. Until this morning. I watched 11 men come up here and walk away, he said. I watched how you handled it. She didn't know what to say to that. You didn't beg, he said. You didn't perform. You answered every question straight, even when the men asking didn't deserve straight answers. He paused. That tells me something. From down in the street, Tobias had stopped crying. All 7 children were looking up at the platform with expressions Martha couldn't quite read from this angle, though Henry's jaw had unclenched slightly. You're not afraid of the mountains, Silas said. It wasn't a question. I've never been to the mountains, she said honestly. But you're not afraid of them. She thought about it. I'm afraid of losing my family, she said. I'm not particularly afraid of anything else right now. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. She didn't think this man arrived at smiles easily. But something that was in the same territory, a small settling, like a thing fitting correctly into its place. Then we understand each other, he said. The paperwork took 11 minutes. Martha signed her name in 3 places. Her hand was steadier than it had any right to be. Aldridge witnessed it with the expression of a man who'd expected this morning to go differently and was still working out how to feel about that. Silas signed where he needed to sign. He read every line first, actually read it, which seemed to make Aldridge and his assistant both slightly nervous, as if they'd assumed the man couldn't or wouldn't. When it was done, Aldridge shuffled his papers into a stack and said, in his official tone, "The arrangement is recorded and binding as of..." He checked his watch. 11:43 a.m., the 14th of November, 18... Thank you, Aldridge, Silas said. Aldridge stopped talking again. Silas stepped to the edge of the platform and looked down at the children, who were all staring up at him with varying degrees of apprehension. He looked at them the same way he'd looked at them from across the crowd, carefully, without rush, like he was taking an actual inventory of actual people rather than a collection of problems. You're Henry, he said. The oldest boy blinked in surprise. Yes, sir. Can you ride? I can ride. Good. His eyes moved to Clara. You're Clara. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded, her chin up, her eyes wary. Yes, sir. He moved down the line. James, Joseph. The twins exchanged a glance. He'd told them apart, which no one outside the family usually managed. James said, How'd you? You stand different, Silas said simply. He looked at Annie, who had forgotten to pretend she wasn't nervous and was just openly nervous. Annie, she nodded. Then he looked at Tobias, who had dried his tears and was looking up at this large, dark-coated stranger with the direct, guileless assessment of a 4-year-old. Silas came down the platform steps and crouched down in front of Tobias, which brought him closer to the boy's level and also clearly cost him something in his knee, given the small, tight movement of his jaw as he bent it. I'm Silas, he said. Tobias looked at him for a long moment. You're big, he said. I am, Silas agreed. Are you going to be our pa? The word hit the cold air between them and hung there. Martha had come down from the platform by then, and she was standing just behind Tobias, and she found she was holding her breath in a way she hadn't consciously decided to do. Silas held Tobias's eyes for a moment. That's between your mother and me, he said. Right now, I'm the man who's going to take you somewhere safe. Does that work? Tobias thought about it with the solemnity of someone taking the question seriously. Okay, he said. Silas straightened, again, that small tightness in his jaw at the knee, and looked at Martha. We leave at first light tomorrow, he said. The pass is navigable now, but there's weather coming. 2 days in the mountains if we move well. He paused. Is there anything you need to collect tonight? I have 2 trunks at the boarding house and Thomas's shotgun, she said. That's all of it. He nodded. No reaction to the smallness of that inventory. No pity, no comment. Just accepted it as information and moved on. I'll arrange a wagon, he said. Have the children ready before dawn. He turned to go. Mr. Crow. He turned back. Martha looked at him for a moment. She wasn't sure what she'd intended to say. Thank you felt inadequate in a way she couldn't fully articulate. The inadequacy of a word pressed against something much larger than it. She thought about the strip of pale sky between the buildings and the 42 men who'd walked away, and the 11 she'd watched him watch from the edge of the crowd. Why did you wait? She asked. If you decided, why did you wait until 11:43? He studied her with that careful expression. Because I wanted to see if you'd hold, he said, until the end. Then he walked away through the dispersing crowd, and the people moved aside for him the same way they'd moved aside when he came in, not quite consciously, just making room for someone who clearly intended to occupy it. Martha told the children at the boarding house that evening. She'd gone over it in her head during the walk back from the main street, trying to find the right way to frame it. She hadn't come up with anything that felt entirely adequate, so she sat them down on the 2 beds in their shared room and told them plainly what had happened and what was going to happen next. Henry absorbed it with the concentrated stillness of someone filing information away. Clara had questions, practical ones, smart ones, which was Clara's nature. The twins looked at each other and had one of those wordless twin conversations, and then James said, "Does he have horses?" And when Martha said yes, he nodded like that settled things. Annie cried a little, but not about the new situation. She cried about leaving Red Hollow, specifically about leaving behind a cat that had been living under the general store that she'd been feeding for 3 months. Martha promised they would find her a better cat. Annie was unconvinced, but accepted the promise. Tobias fell asleep during the explanation and didn't hear any of it. Henry waited until the younger ones were occupied and then came and sat next to Martha on the edge of the bed. He was 14, and in the past 2 years he'd done so much growing up that sometimes she looked at him and felt a pang at the boy he'd been before Thomas died. The one who'd chase fireflies and make up ridiculous songs and eat 4 helpings of anything put in front of him without a care in the world. Is he a good man? Henry said. Martha thought about Silas Crow crouching down in front of Tobias. She thought about the way he'd read the contract. She thought about the scar on his jaw and the stillness in his face and the thing he'd said about wanting to see if she'd hold until the end. I think he might be, she said carefully. I don't know him well enough to be certain. Henry was quiet for a moment. What if he's not? She looked at her oldest son. In the lamplight, his face looked older than 14 and younger than 14 at the same time, which was the particular quality of being 14, she supposed. Then we figure that out together, she said, the same way we figured out everything else. Henry looked at his hands. You're not scared? The honest answer was complicated. She was scared of about 15 different things, a few of which she was scared to look at too directly. She was scared of the mountains a little, for all she'd told Silas otherwise. She was scared of what she didn't know about this man. She was scared of what it meant to put her children's safety in the hands of a stranger based on 45 minutes of observation and 1 signed document. But she was more scared of the alternative. She was more scared of the specific image that had been living in her chest all day. Tobias being lifted into a government wagon in Pemberton, 60 miles away, looking back for her and not seeing her. That image was the thing she'd been pressing down all morning. That was the thing she'd been holding away from herself, at arm's length, so she could keep standing on that platform. I'm always scared, she told Henry. Being scared isn't the problem. Stopping is the problem. Henry didn't say anything, but he put his hand over hers on the edge of the bed, briefly, and then got up and went to check on the twins. Martha packed the 2 trunks that night, after the children were asleep. There wasn't much to decide. She'd already stripped it down to what was necessary before the auction, sold off what she could, and given the rest to neighbors. The green wool dress went back into the trunk. She put Thomas's tools in first, the good ones, because Henry would need them. Then the winter things. the medicines, the sewing kit, the 3 books she'd kept because she couldn't make herself leave them. At the bottom of the second trunk, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was Thomas's photograph. Not a wedding portrait. They hadn't had money for that. A photograph taken by a traveling photographer the summer James and Joseph were born, Thomas squinting slightly in the sun and not quite smiling because he'd always been self-conscious about his teeth. She'd looked at this photograph nearly every day for 2 years. She looked at it now for a long moment. "I kept them together," she told him silently. "All 7 of them. I don't know what comes next. But I kept them together." She wrapped the oilcloth back around it carefully and put it in the trunk. She latched both trunks and sat down on the floor between them because there was no room for a chair. Outside, Red Hollow was quiet. The particular after-dark quiet of a small frontier town in winter. Nothing moving except the wind, and somewhere distantly, a dog barking at something in the cold. Tomorrow they'd leave it. She realized, sitting there on the floor between 2 trunks that held the entirety of her life, that she didn't feel much about that. Red Hollow had never been kind to her family, not really. It had been a place to survive in, a terrain to get through. Thomas's death had made it harder and smaller, and eventually it had made it into this, into a wooden platform in the frozen mud, and 42 men walking away and a deadline with a pen uncapped. Whatever the mountains were, they weren't this. She got up off the floor, turned down the lamp, and lay down on the narrow boarding house bed in her clothes. She didn't sleep for a long time, but she didn't cry either. Silas had the wagon at the side door of the boarding house at 5:40 in the morning, which was before actual sunrise, but after the sky had started suggesting it was coming. The children were loaded with varying degrees of alertness. Tobias was entirely asleep and had to be carried by Henry. Annie was awake enough to direct her own boarding, but fell back asleep against Clara within 10 minutes of moving. The twins were inexplicably and energetically awake, which was either a character quality or a curse, depending on how you looked at it, and spent the first portion of the journey conducting a whispered argument about something Martha couldn't follow. Martha sat in the front of the wagon next to Silas. They didn't talk much the first hours. The wagon moved out of Red Hollow in the early gray light, past the still dark storefronts and the silent church and the platform that was just bare wood in the pale morning, already reduced to something ordinary and meaningless. No one came out to see them off. She hadn't expected anyone. The road northwest out of town was passable but had seen better days. The wheel ruts were deep and frozen, and the wagon lurched through them in a way that kept threatening to tip without ever actually doing it. Silas handled it without comment, making adjustments to the reins in small, practiced ways that kept them moving without drama. "You know these roads," Martha said. Not an accusation, just noting it. "Made this run enough," he said. "How often do you come to town?" 3-4 times a year. Supplies, business." A pause. "More than I'd like." She almost smiled. "You really don't like town. Towns have too many people in them with too many opinions about things that aren't their business." She thought about the crowd at the platform, the men who'd made calculations out loud, the people who'd laughed. Can't argue that. He glanced at her sideways. She got the impression it wasn't something he did often. That sideways glance, that small concession to social calibration. "The children," he said, "in the wagon. Are they always like that?" She looked back. The twins had graduated from whispering to a muffled but audible disagreement. Clara had apparently fallen asleep. Henry was watching the road behind them with an expression of studied caution. "More or less," she said. "James and Joseph argue from sunup to sundown about nothing in particular, and it somehow never becomes an actual fight. Henry is—" She searched for the right word. "Henry has been carrying too much weight for 2 years. He needs to put it down, but he doesn't know how yet." Silas looked at the road ahead. "He's protecting you," he said, "making sure I'm not a threat." "Yes." "Smart," he said. "No judgment in it, just acknowledgement." They rode in silence for a while. The road began to climb gradually, the flat land giving way to the first long slopes that marked the beginning of the foothills. The trees got taller and closer together. The air got sharper. "What happened to your husband?" Silas said. The question was direct, but not unkind. She'd already gathered that he wasn't much for approach, that if something needed saying, he said it. "Fever," she said. "Winter before last. It took him fast. 3 days from onset." She paused. "He was a good man. Decent farmer. Better husband than farmer, probably, which she stopped, surprised at herself for almost making a joke in that direction. Which didn't help the farm, Silas said. No, she agreed. It didn't. Another silence. The horses moved through it steadily, their breath misting in the cold air. My wife, Silas said. He didn't finish the sentence immediately, but Martha had the sense he would, given room. She gave him room. 6 years ago, he said. Childbirth. The child, too. She didn't say anything for a moment. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. He said it the way people say things that are not actually a long time ago, and they know it, but that they've learned to say that way because the alternative is having the conversation every time it comes up. It doesn't get shorter, she said quietly. He looked at her again, that same sideways look. No, he said. It doesn't. The road curved west, and ahead of them, at the end of a long, straight stretch, the mountains materialized out of the morning haze, enormous and white and absolute, rising above the tree line like the edge of a different world entirely. Martha had never seen them up close. Even from Red Hollow, they'd only been a smear of white at the horizon, something theoretical. Up here, approaching, they were something else. They were vast in a way that made her chest do something complicated, something partway between fear and relief, something in the vicinity of perspective. Tobias woke up in his wagon bed behind her and said, Mama. She turned. He was sitting up, blanket around his shoulders, staring at the mountains with his 4-year-old eyes wide. Mama, are those the biggest mountains? I think they might be, she said. We're going there? Yes. He looked at them for another long moment. Then he looked at the back of Silas's head. Is it your mountain? He asked. Part of it, Silas said, without turning around. The valley in the middle there. The whole valley. Most of it. Tobias considered this. Okay, he said, in the tone of someone who has found something acceptable, and lay back down and went back to sleep. The foothills ate up the morning. By midday they'd climbed enough that Red Hollow had vanished entirely below them. Not just out of sight, but out of conceptual range, swallowed by the folds of the land. The world up here was narrower and taller and full of a cold silence that was different from the silence of the plains. It had texture to it, this silence. The sound of wind through pine, the creak of the wagon, the muffled percussion of hoofbeats on packed snow. The children woke fully by mid-morning and spread themselves around the wagon with the adaptability of children, who are generally better at absorbing new realities than adults give them credit for. Clara read from one of the books Martha had packed. James and Joseph conducted a truce and were now identifying animal tracks in the snow along the roadside with varying degrees of accuracy. Annie had positioned herself directly behind the seat and was periodically inserting herself into the conversation between Martha and Silas, with zero self-consciousness. What's your house like? Annie asked, around the 5th hour of travel. Silas was quiet for a moment. Large, he said. Bigger than you've probably lived in. Annie considered this. We lived in a farmhouse, she said. It had 4 rooms. More than 4 rooms, Silas said. How many? 7, he said. Then, with what Martha thought might be a very small degree of discomfort, I haven't counted recently. 7 rooms, Annie said, with considerable satisfaction. She turned to relay this information to Clara, as if she'd personally arranged it. Henry, from the back of the wagon, said nothing. He was still watching the road behind them. Around mid-afternoon, the sky changed. It happened quickly, the way it does in the high country. The light went flat and gray. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees that Martha felt through her coat immediately, and the wind that had been intermittent and mild became something with more intent behind it. Silas looked at the sky with the particular expression of a man reading something in it. There's a trapper's cabin 2 miles ahead, he said, north side of the trail. Is that a problem? Martha asked. The weather's moving faster than I figured. He looked at the clouds building behind the western peaks. We're going to be in it inside of an hour. Martha followed his gaze. The clouds were the color of old iron, heavy and dense and moving with purpose. Can we make the pass before it hits? No, he said, flat and simple. No cushioning of it. We're making for the cabin. He picked up the pace without further discussion, and Martha turned to check on the children and tell them to hold on, and behind them the western sky went from gray to the color of lead, and the first tentative fingers of snow began to find their way down through the pines. They reached the cabin in just under 40 minutes. The last stretch was rough. The trail narrowed and the wind had gone from intent to outright hostile, cutting through everything, and the horses were fighting it. Silas kept them moving with steady hands and a low, even voice that Martha found herself listening to from the side, the way you listen to a sound that keeps a larger noise from being overwhelming. The cabin appeared through the trees like something from another time. Small, solidly built, half buried in old snowdrifts on its north side. The door had a wooden crossbar. The roof looked sound. Silas had the wagon under the trees and the horses tied and sheltered before the real snow started. He did it with an efficiency that suggested he'd done versions of this before, in worse conditions, and the children picked up on the seriousness of his movements and responded to it, following his directions without the usual argument. "Henry, help me with the horses. Clara, get the little ones inside and get a fire going. There's wood stacked by the east wall." Henry, who had not yet decided what he thought of this man, looked at him for a half-second. Then he jumped down from the wagon without a word and went to the horses. Martha got Tobias and Annie through the door first, then went back for the packs. Silas was beside her before she got 2 steps. "I'll get those," he said. "I didn't say you couldn't." He took the packs from her. "Get inside with your children." She would have pushed back on the phrasing, possibly, under different circumstances. Under these circumstances, the wind now moving at something approaching violent, the temperature dropping with every minute, the trees bending and throwing snow in sideways sheets, she went inside. Clara had the fire going by the time Martha got through the door. 12 years old, and she'd gotten a fire going in an unfamiliar cabin in under 5 minutes. Martha looked at her daughter and felt something she often felt about Clara and didn't know the right word for. A combination of pride and something that was almost grief. The way watching a child be more capable than a child should have to be sometimes felt like both things at once. "Good girl," she said. Clara shrugged with one shoulder, already feeding the fire another piece of wood. The wood was dry. Silas got the packs inside and then went back for 2 more loads, moving through the building storm with unhurried speed, and by the time he came through the door the last time and pulled it shut against the wind, the world outside had reduced itself to a solid roaring white. The cabin went quiet in the way of a sheltered space. The storm suddenly outside rather than all around, and in the relative quiet they could hear each other breathe. 7 children, 2 trunks, 1 stranger, 1 storm. Martha looked around the small cabin, the rough walls, the single window that was already white with snow, the fire beginning to properly catch. Her children arranged around it in various states of adjustment, and she felt something that wasn't peace exactly, but was adjacent to it. Not safe. She knew better than to feel safe based on a cabin wall and a 2-hour acquaintance, but held, maybe. Held against something. That was enough for tonight. Silas set down the last pack and stood for a moment with his back to the door, scanning the cabin the way he scanned everything. Systematically, without rush. His eyes moved to the children, counting them, confirming them, and then briefly to Martha. "We'll be here until morning at earliest," he said. "Possibly until this breaks." How long could it last? Mountain storm. He looked at the window. Could be 12 hours, could be 3 days. Annie, from her position near the fire, said, "3 days?" in a tone of authentic existential distress. "Could be," Silas said. No softening of it. Annie turned to Martha with the expression of someone who requires reassurance. "It's all right," Martha said. "We've weathered storms before." "Not in a mountain cabin with a stranger," Annie pointed out. "That's true," Martha said. "That's new." Silas had gone to the supply shelf on the east wall and was conducting an inventory with the same expression he applied to everything. He said, without turning around, "There are dried provisions here. Enough for 4 days. Blankets in the chest under the window. The flue draws well." "How do you know this cabin?" Clara asked. She was watching him with the particular attention she gave things she hadn't decided about yet. "I've used it before," he said. "When?" He turned and looked at her. She looked back. There was a brief mutual assessment. 3 winters ago I got caught in a storm worse than this one on the return from Pemberton," he said. "This cabin is the reason I made it back." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Did you have to stay 3 days?" 4. She thought about this. Were you alone? Yes. She looked at him for another moment. That sounds bad, she said. Not with pity, just with honest acknowledgement. It wasn't pleasant, he agreed. And Martha watched this happen because she couldn't have looked away. Something moved across Clara's 12-year-old face. A very small recalibration. The wariness didn't leave, but it shifted slightly to one side to make room for something else. Well, Clara said, there are 9 of us this time. Silas looked at her. For a moment his expression did the thing it had done on the platform, that small settling. There are, he said. Outside, the storm threw itself against the walls of the cabin with everything it had, and inside the fire climbed and caught and spread its uneven warmth over all of them, and no one was entirely okay, and no one was entirely sure of anything, and the night was going to be long. But they were in it together. That was something. That was the whole of it, really. That was everything. The fire burned low around midnight. Martha woke to the sound of it. Not the crackling, but the absence of it, that specific quiet that a dying fire makes when it's given up on producing sound and is just working on surviving until morning. She lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the storm outside, which had not moderated at all. If anything, it had deepened, settled in with the conviction of something that had nowhere else to be. Around her, the children were asleep. She could hear them, the small sounds of 7 people breathing in various rhythms. Annie's faint whistling exhale, the twins somehow managing to snore in approximate unison, Tobias making the small animal sounds he always made in deep sleep. Clara had fallen asleep sitting up against the wall with her book open on her lap and hadn't moved in hours. Henry was on his side near the door, facing the room, which was so characteristic of him that Martha felt the familiar pang of it. She sat up carefully and reached for another piece of wood from the pile Clara had stacked earlier. I'll get it. The voice came from the corner near the window, low and quiet, and Martha startled badly enough that she knocked her elbow against the wall. Silas was sitting in the cabin's single chair, which she hadn't realized because she'd assumed he was asleep somewhere on the other side of the room. He'd taken off his coat and was sitting in his shirt sleeves with his forearms on his knees, and in the almost dark he looked like a man who'd been awake for a while and was comfortable with it. You scared me half to death, she said, keeping her voice low so as not to wake the children. Sorry, he said, and he did sound it, briefly. He came across the room and fed 2 pieces of wood to the fire with the practiced economy of someone who knew exactly how much a fire this size needed and wasn't going to waste anything finding out. The flames caught within a minute, spreading orange light back across the floor. Martha pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. How long have you been awake? I don't sleep well in unfamiliar places, he said. He straightened and looked at the fire for a moment. I don't sleep particularly well in familiar places either, if I'm honest. Is that a recent problem or an old one? He considered this. Old, he said. She nodded. She understood old problems. She had several of her own. He went back to his chair and she stayed where she was, and for a while neither of them spoke, which was, surprisingly, not uncomfortable. The fire worked. The storm moved against the walls. The children breathed. Can I ask you something? Martha said. You can ask. The people in Red Hollow, when you said your name, people got quiet. Why? He was quiet for a moment himself, not in the way of someone deciding whether to answer, more in the way of someone deciding how. I had a disagreement 3 years ago with a man named Cutter Briggs, he said. He ran cattle on the South Range and had a habit of letting his herd drift onto neighboring land and then being slow to acknowledge it. What kind of disagreement? The kind where it stopped being words, he said. He came up to my property line with 4 men and an argument I wasn't interested in having. I sent them back. All 4 of them. Yes. She looked at him in the firelight, the scar on his jaw, the stillness. Were they hurt? Briggs had a broken arm, he said. One of his men had a dislocated shoulder. The other 2 were unhurt, but also uninterested in continuing the conversation. A pause. Briggs filed a complaint with the county. The county reviewed it and found in my favor. And people remembered. Small towns remember that kind of thing. He shifted in the chair slightly. I'm not proud of it, specifically. I handled it the way I knew how to handle it. I've thought since that there might have been a better way. He said this without any particular performance of remorse, just as a fact he'd arrived at over time. But I'm also not going to pretend Briggs didn't need stopping. Martha absorbed this. She thought about what he'd said on the platform. I don't drink to excess. I've never raised a hand to a woman or a child. And the careful specificity of that wording, which now made a different kind of sense. Is that why you were the last one? She said. At the auction, people in town know who you are, and they left room, he said. A brief pause. Possibly. Another pause, and then something that surprised her. I hadn't considered that. You hadn't considered that your reputation might have cleared the field for you? No, he said. He sounded genuinely struck by it, which was interesting. A man who could send 4 armed men home with broken bones apparently hadn't run the social arithmetic on his own effect on a crowd. I suppose that's possible. It's likely, Martha said. He looked at her. Does that bother you? She thought about the 42 men, about Garrett and his calculations, about the ones who'd laughed. No, she said. Those 42 men made their choices of their own free will. Nobody kept them away. They left because they wanted to. She paused. You came because you wanted to. The fire popped once, sending a small shower of sparks up the flue. Can I ask you something? He said. Seems fair. What was your husband like? Not the circumstances. Him. She wasn't expecting the question. She took a moment with it. Stubborn. Stubborn, she said. Stubbornly optimistic, which is a particular kind of stubborn that's exhausting to live with some days and wonderful on others. He always believed the next season would be better than this one. She looked at the fire. He was also funny in a quiet way that you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. He'd say something completely ridiculous with a completely straight face and then watch you figure it out. She paused. He was a good father. That was the truest thing about him. Silas was quiet for a moment. He sounds like a man worth mourning. He was, she said. Simple as that. They sat in the fire quiet for another while. Outside, the storm kept up its argument with the mountain, relentless and impersonal, and inside the cabin the warmth held. And Martha found herself thinking that this was a strange thing, sitting in the middle of a blizzard in a stranger's company and not feeling the specific cold fear that had been living in her chest for 2 years. Not feeling safe, precisely, but not feeling alone in quite the same way. It was different. She didn't know what to do with different yet, but she noted it. My wife's name was Eleanor, Silas said. He said it to the fire, not to her, and she understood this was not an invitation to respond so much as a thing that had found its way out, maybe because it was the middle of the night and he hadn't slept, and there was something about firelight and storms that dissolved certain defenses. She was from Pemberton originally. Her father thought I was a poor prospect, and he was probably right at the time. I was 26, and the ranch was 2 years old, and I was still figuring out which of my ideas were good and which ones were going to get me killed. A pause. She thought differently. She thought I was going to build something worth building. Another pause. She wasn't wrong about that part. Martha said nothing. She just listened. She was small, he said. I mean, small in the physical sense. She used to say the mountains made everyone look small, but she meant it as a compliment to the mountains. He was quiet for a moment. She'd have liked this cabin, I think. She liked small, contained spaces. She said big rooms made her feel like she was always forgetting something. She sounds like she was her own person, Martha said quietly. Entirely, he said. She argued with me about almost everything. A brief silence. I miss that part most, actually. Someone who argued back. It was an unexpected thing to say, and because it was unexpected, Martha believed it completely. Clara will argue with you, she said, about almost anything, if you give her the opportunity. Something moved across Silas's face, that same small settling she'd seen twice before. I noticed, he said. Tobias made a small noise in his sleep and rolled over, burrowing deeper into the blanket Henry had arranged around him sometime in the night. Silas looked at him for a moment with an expression that was hard to read in the firelight. Not soft exactly, but open in some way that his face wasn't usually open. He's not afraid of much, Silas observed. He's 4, Martha said. He doesn't have the information yet. Some people never get the information. That's different. That's just not paying attention. Silas made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him. Brief, almost involuntary, like it caught him by surprise. She found that she liked it. She also found that she noticed she liked it, which felt like a separate piece of information worth filing away somewhere. The storm peaked somewhere around 2 in the morning and then, very slowly, began to exhaust itself. Martha felt the change in it before she heard it. A slight giving way in the sound, like something letting go of its grip. By 3, the wind had reduced from a roar to a hard, steady blow. By 4, it was a cold whistle around the corners. She had fallen asleep again without deciding to, leaning against the wall with her coat pulled around her. And when she woke, the fire was well tended, and Silas was making something on the small iron stove in the corner. She could hear it, the small sounds of a person managing a fire in a pot, careful not to wake anyone. She watched him for a moment through half-closed eyes before he knew she was awake. He moved quietly for a large man. Not stealthily, just with the habitual care of someone used to being the only person awake in a space where others were sleeping. He added water to the pot. He checked the fire. He turned and saw her eyes open and didn't startle. "Coffee," he said, "and something that will pass for breakfast." "You cook?" she said. "Badly," he said, "but adequately." It was a reasonable self-assessment, she discovered. The coffee was strong enough to offend some people, and the porridge was plain and slightly scorched on the bottom of the pot. But by the time the children woke up one by one, the twins first, then Henry, then Annie, with Clara and Tobias trailing in, there was something warm, and it was enough, and nobody complained. And Silas doled it out without being asked and without making anything of it. Henry watched him the whole time. Martha watched Henry watching him. It was like observing a complicated piece of machinery trying to decide whether another piece of machinery was compatible. After breakfast, Tobias climbed up onto the supply chest near the window and looked out at the world, which had transformed overnight into something white and still and enormous. "It's all snow," he announced. "Yes," Silas said. "All of it?" "Most of what you can see." Tobias pressed his nose against the glass. "How do we get through?" "We'll wait for it to settle and then we'll go slow." Tobias turned from the window and looked at Silas with his absolute 4-year-old directness. "Are you good at going slow?" "Not especially," Silas said. "Mama is," Tobias said, as if offering a solution. Martha, across the cabin, said, "Tobias." "It's true," Tobias said with the unassailable logic of the very young. "You always say slow is how you don't fall." Silas looked at Martha. She looked back at him. "He's not wrong," Silas said. They moved out around 9, when the trail had settled enough that the horses could find their footing without fighting for it. The world after the storm was so quiet, it felt like something had been taken out of the air. All the sound compressed and packed away under the snow, leaving only the crunch of the wagon wheels and the soft percussion of the horses, and periodically, one of the twins noticing an animal track or a snow-bent branch and announcing it to everyone. Martha rode up front again. The mountains were different this morning. The storm had stripped them of any ambiguity, all their edges sharpened and defined against a sky that was the specific pale blue of very cold, very clear air. They were closer now, or felt closer. The trail had climbed enough that she could see the beginning of the real switchbacks ahead, the places where the road tilted seriously upward. "How much further?" Clara asked from behind her. "Half a day in these conditions," Silas said. "Maybe more." "What's the ranch like?" Clara asked. She was working up to something, Martha could tell. Clara didn't ask questions without direction. "I told Annie," Silas said. 7 rooms, more livestock than people." "Do you have books?" A pause. "Some." "What kind?" "Clara," Martha said. "I'm asking," Clara said, unapologetically. "History, mostly," Silas said. "Some practical volumes, veterinary medicine, construction, land management." He seemed to consider this and find it potentially inadequate. "There are some others. I can't tell you the titles from here." "Do you read them or just own them?" "Clara." "I'm trying to determine something," Clara said. "What?" Martha said. "Whether he actually reads or whether the books are furniture." Silas said without inflection, "I read them." "All of them?" "Most of them." Clara was quiet for a moment, processing. "Okay," she said finally, in a tone that suggested this had passed some internal threshold. "Henry, from his spot in the wagon bed, said nothing. But Martha noticed that his jaw had unclenched again, slightly. The morning moved. The trail climbed. The trees closed in on either side and then opened again at a ridge that gave a view back the way they'd come. Miles and miles of white-covered land falling away to the flat territory below. Red Hollow, invisible somewhere in the distance, swallowed by the landscape entirely. Martha looked back for a long moment. Silas didn't say anything. He let her look. "All right," she said finally, and faced forward. "All right," he said, and the horses kept moving. It was around midday when they hit the ice. The trail at a certain elevation had been shaded by the ridge above it, and the melt from the morning had refrozen on the packed snow in a way that made the surface glassy and unpredictable. The horses felt it before anyone else did. Their gait changed, became more tentative, heads dropping slightly as they tested each step. Silas felt it through the reins before he saw it. He slowed them to a walk. "Ice," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Bad?" Martha asked. "Manageable," he said, and then corrected himself. "Probably manageable." He took the horses through it slowly, genuinely slowly, slower than Martha thought he was naturally inclined to go, with constant small adjustments to the reins and his weight on the seat, reading the horses and the surface simultaneously. It was, she realized, a kind of fluency. The way he handled the team was the same way some people handled language, not thinking about it exactly, just speaking it, the knowledge living in his hands rather than his head. They were 3/4 through the icy stretch when the left rear wheel found the bad patch. It happened fast and slow at the same time, the way accidents do. The wheel skidded on a diagonal, the wagon lurched left, and for one elongated second the whole rig was going sideways toward the drop at the edge of the trail, and Martha's hand shot out and grabbed Silas's arm without any decision being involved. The horses, responding to some signal she hadn't seen Silas give, lunged right. The wagon corrected. The wheel found solid ground. They were stopped, still on the trail, nobody in the canyon below. Behind her, the children were silent. Then Tobias said, "That was scary." "Yes," Silas said. He was looking at the edge of the trail, which was uncomfortably close. His voice was level, his jaw was tight. Martha realized she was still holding his arm. She let go. "Is everyone—" she started. "Fine," said Henry, clipped. "Everyone's fine." "That was too close," James said. "Don't tell me how close it was," Joseph said. "I was there." Silas got down from the wagon and walked the rest of the icy stretch on foot, leading the horses by the bridle, one hand steady on the nearest animal's face, talking to them in a low, continuous murmur that Martha couldn't hear from the wagon. Henry got down and walked on the other side without being asked. For 20 yards they went like that, Silas and Henry, one on each side of the team, guiding them through the ice. When they reached solid ground, Silas looked at Henry across the horses. "Good," he said. One word. Henry straightened slightly. "I've handled horses in bad conditions before," he said. "Not defensive, just informing." "I can see that," Silas said. They climbed back onto the wagon. The trail continued. Nobody said much for a while, and the silence was a different kind now. Not the comfortable kind of the cabin in the small hours, but the particular silence that comes after something goes wrong and doesn't. And all the things that could have happened are still echoing around in your chest looking for somewhere to settle. Martha's heart was still running fast. She sat with it, the way she'd learned to sit with fear, not trying to push it down, but not giving it the wheel either, just letting it run its course while she kept doing the next thing, and the next. Her hand still felt the shape of his arm, where she'd grabbed it. She focused on the trail ahead. The road crested a long ridge around mid-afternoon and then began to descend, and as it descended, the trees opened up, and there, spread out below them in the declining winter light, was Crow Valley. It wasn't what she'd imagined, though she wasn't sure she'd had a clear image. The valley was wider than she'd expected, broader through the middle, with a frozen creek running the length of it, and stands of pine so tall they looked like they'd been there since before anyone had a name for anything. The floor of the valley was snow-covered, but clearly organized. She could see the shapes of fenced pastures, outbuildings, what looked like a substantial barn, and further in, set against the tree line on the northern slope, the house. Even from this distance, it was clearly not what the men in Red Hollow had built for themselves. It was large and dark-logged and looked like something that had been added to over years rather than built all at once. The shape of it slightly asymmetrical, extensions going in two directions, a wide porch along the front. "That's it," Silas said. Nobody said anything for a moment. "It's bigger than I thought," Henry said. He said it carefully, like he was testing the words. "I told Annie 7 rooms," Silas said. "It's closer to 9. I miscounted." He paused. "Or I stopped counting before I was finished." Martha looked at the house and the valley and the enormous trees standing along its edges like they were keeping something in or something out. She couldn't decide which. She thought about the boarding house in Red Hollow. 2 rooms, 9 people. She thought about the farm before that, 4 rooms and a barn, and the wind coming through the kitchen wall, no matter what Thomas did to it. She thought about what it meant that this man had come to the auction alone, without anyone who knew him, and bought... No, that wasn't the right word. He hadn't bought anything. He'd... what? Chosen. He'd chosen. And she still didn't fully understand why, and she'd made her peace with not understanding it yet, but looking at this valley now, the scale of it, the solidity of it, she felt the weight of what she was entering land on her differently than it had in Red Hollow, more concretely. This was real. They were really here. "Mama," Clara quietly, from behind her. "Are you okay?" "Yes," Martha said. She meant it, and she wasn't sure she meant it, and both of those things were true at the same time. "I could see 9 rooms from here," Annie announced, "if I counted the right way." "You can't see 9 rooms from a mountain," James said. "I'm not counting the rooms. I'm counting the windows and extrapolating." "You don't know what extrapolating means." "I know exactly what it means. It means you use what you can see to figure out what you can't." Martha almost laughed. The almost laugh loosened something in her chest that needed loosening. Silas guided the horses down the switchback descent without comment. The valley came up to meet them gradually, the trees getting taller, the house getting larger, the shapes of things becoming more defined as they descended. A hay barn, a small forge shed, a chicken coop with snow on its roof, a fence line that went further than she could see. A working ranch, a real one. She could see it was real in the way only a person who'd spent years on a struggling farm could see it. Not in the aesthetic sense, but in the functional one, the evidence of someone who'd built things that worked and kept them working. When they reached the valley floor and passed through the gate in the outer fence, Silas said, "There are 2 hired men, Abe and Peter. They'll have kept things going while I was in town. They know I was coming back with..." He paused. "With people." "Did you tell them how many?" Martha asked. "I told them more than one," he said. She glanced at him. "That's all you said?" "I said it was a family arrangement," he said, "and that I needed the east wing cleared out." "The east wing," she repeated. 4 rooms, he said, connected, smaller than the main part of the house, but private. It made more sense than... He stopped. "I thought it would be easier for the children to have their own..." He stopped again, less comfortable with this line than with most things. "Space," he finished. Martha looked at him for a moment. He was looking at the barn ahead rather than at her, his expression the closed-off, slightly uncomfortable look of a man who has done something that might be interpreted as considerate and would rather not have to discuss it. "Thank you," she said, quietly. He nodded once, short and final, the way he accepted acknowledgement. They pulled up to the barn as the last of the afternoon light was going gold across the valley, and before Silas could set the brake, 2 men came out, one older, broad-built, moving with the care of a person whose knees had opinions about cold weather. One younger, maybe 20, with an open face and ears that stuck out from under his hat. Both of them stopped and looked at the wagon with expressions that went through approximately 4 phases in 2 seconds. The older one, Abe, Martha guessed, put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at Silas. "You said a family," he said. "I did," Silas said. Abe counted the children with his eyes. His expression was not unkind. It was the expression of a man revising a number upward. "All right then," he said. The younger one, Peter, was looking at the twins the way people look at mirrors that disagree with each other. "They the same?" he said. "We're twins," James said. "I can see that," Peter said. "Which one are you?" "James," Peter looked at Joseph. "And you're..." "Don't guess," Joseph said. "Nobody ever gets it right." "Joseph," Silas said. Both twins looked at him. You stand different, Silas said, again, the same thing he'd said in Red Hollow. James leans left. Joseph doesn't. Peter stared at Silas. Then he looked at the twins, then back at Silas. How do you... Pay attention, Silas said, and got down from the wagon. It was cold and getting colder, the valley losing its light fast as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, and there was a wagon to unload and horses to settle and children to feed. And Abe and Peter and Henry fell into the work of it without any particular coordination becoming necessary, just people doing what needed doing in the way of people who know what work looks like. Martha stood for a moment in the blue going dark of the valley and looked up at the house. The lit windows in the east wing where someone had clearly already set fires, the porch that ran across the whole front, the smoke coming from 2 chimneys, and she breathed in the cold air of this place, which smelled like pine and horses and wood smoke and ice and nothing else, not like Red Hollow, not like the farm, like something entirely its own. Behind her, Tobias had been set down from the wagon and was standing in the snow, looking up at the trees at the edge of the property with his 4-year-old eyes wide and serious. Silas, he said. Silas, who was unhitching one of the horses, looked over. Do the trees always go that high? Tobias asked. Silas looked up at the trees as if checking. Yes, he said. Tobias considered this for a long time. Okay, he said. He reached out and took Martha's hand. She held it. The valley went dark around them, and the windows of the house glowed. And whatever came next, the morning, the work, the slow, careful business of learning to live in the same space as a stranger, whatever all of that was, it was starting now. She was not ready. She was also already here. They had been at the ranch 11 days when Silas said they needed to go back through the pass. Not all the way to Red Hollow, just to the supply depot at Garner's Crossing, a trading post that sat at the base of the eastern approach, half a day's ride from the valley. There were things he'd been expecting before the storm hit: feed grain, rope, medicines for the livestock. And the order had been sitting at Garner's for 2 weeks now. With winter settling in properly, he couldn't leave it much longer. Martha heard the plan at breakfast and said she and Henry would come. Silas started to say something, and she looked at him across the table in a way that closed that particular conversation before it opened. He'd been learning, these 11 days, when that look appeared and what it meant. Henry said he was coming before anyone asked him. The 11 days had been not easy, but real. That was the word Martha kept coming back to. Real in the way that work is real, the way cold mornings are real, the way learning how a new place operates is real, full of small frictions and adjustments and moments that were neither good nor bad, but simply the texture of a life being built in the space where another life used to be. The house was larger than anything she'd lived in, which created its own strange anxiety at first, the feeling of not knowing where to stand in a room. The east wing was 4 rooms off a short connecting hallway, and within 3 days the children had organized it to their satisfaction in ways she hadn't directed. The older 3 in one room, the twins in another, Annie and Tobias in the third, and the fourth claimed immediately by Clara as what she called a reading room and what James called a complete waste of a perfectly good room. The argument had echoed through the hallway for the better part of an afternoon. Nobody had come to Martha about it, which meant they'd resolved it themselves, which meant she'd sat in the kitchen and let herself feel briefly, privately, grateful. Silas moved through the main house with the habits of a man who'd been alone in it for 6 years and was now recalibrating. She watched him do it, watched him stop at the kitchen doorway when he found Annie there making a mess of his flour, trying to help Peter with the bread. Watched him look at the boots now lined up by the front door instead of the single pair that had always been there. Watched him find a book moved from one shelf to another and stand there for a moment holding it before putting it back. He didn't say anything about any of it. He just incorporated the changes the same way he'd incorporated the weather on the trail, with steady, slightly tight-jawed acceptance. On the 5th day, Clara had asked him directly whether she could borrow the history of the Western Territories that she'd found on the 3rd shelf from the top. He'd said yes. She'd brought it back 3 days later with a handwritten list of questions about Chapter 7 stuck inside the front cover. He'd found the list while reaching for the book, read it, and come to find her at the kitchen table that evening. They'd talked for an hour. Martha had not interrupted. She'd sat on the other side of the room, mending a shirt, and listened to her 12-year-old daughter argue with a mountain rancher about settlement patterns and land rights. And she'd thought, this is a thing that is happening. This is real. Henry was slower. Henry was always slower, not because he was less perceptive, but because he was more careful. He took longer to trust things that seemed too good, because the last 2 years had taught him that good things sometimes ended fast and without warning. He worked alongside Silas and Abe and Peter during the days without complaint, did everything asked of him and a few things not asked, and at night he was quiet in a way that wasn't hostile, just withheld, waiting for information. Silas didn't push him, which was, Martha thought, exactly the right call. The morning they left for Garner's Crossing was clear and brutal. 20 below at dawn, the valley floor crackling with frost, every breath a visible thing. Abe stayed with the younger children, which he accepted with the resignation of a man who had opinions about it, but had assessed the situation and decided his opinions were not what was needed. Peter hovered until Silas told him the south fence needed checking, at which point Peter found somewhere else to be. Martha rode between Silas and Henry, which wasn't planned but happened naturally as they moved out. Silas was on his dark horse, a large animal named, improbably, something she'd misheard the first time and had turned out to actually be called Button, which Silas had named him for reasons he declined to explain. And Henry was on the smaller bay mare that had been standing unused in the barn since the hired men had taken over her usual work. The pass road was hard-packed and manageable. Button moved through it without complaint. Henry's mare was more tentative about the ice, but Henry handled her the way Silas had watched him handle the team on the trail. Quiet hands, patient weight shifts. They didn't talk much on the way out. The cold didn't encourage it, and there was something about the mountain air in winter that created its own kind of silence, not uncomfortable, but encompassing. Martha watched the trees and the sky and the way the light came through the pines at this hour, low and sideways and very clean. Garner's Crossing was 3 buildings and a frozen water trough. The trading post itself was warm inside, overheatedly so, with a stove in the center of the room burning something that smelled of pine tar. The man behind the counter, a compact, weathered person named Harlow, who had been running the depot for 20 years and had apparently seen most things, looked at Silas and nodded and went to find the order without being asked. Henry walked the perimeter of the store the way he walked all new spaces, checking the inventory on the shelves with his eyes. Martha stood near the stove and let the warmth into her fingers. "You're the Whitlock woman," Harlow said from behind a stack of grain sacks. "From Red Hollow." She turned. He said it without particular judgment, just identifying information. "I was," she said. Martha Crow now. She'd said it for the first time. She heard it in the air and felt something settle slightly. Harlow nodded. He didn't comment on the arrangement or what it meant, or any of the things people in Red Hollow would have commented on. He set the grain sacks on the counter and went back for the rest. They loaded the supplies onto the pack horse Silas had brought for the purpose, and were back on the pass road by late morning, heading home. The day was warming slightly, which in February in the mountains meant it had climbed from murderous to merely uncomfortable. They were an hour out from Garner's on the return, on the long eastern switchback that curved through a narrow cut in the ridge, when Henry said, "Someone's on the trail behind us." Martha turned. Silas already had 3 riders, maybe a quarter-mile back, moving at a pace that wasn't casual. Not galloping, but deliberate, the kind of pace that was faster than the terrain called for, that said the people doing it had a destination they were certain about. "Could be travelers," Martha said. "Could be," Silas said. He wasn't looking behind them anymore. He was looking ahead, and specifically at the cut in the ridge, and she realized he was thinking about the terrain the same way he'd been thinking about the ice on the trail, reading it, calculating. "Do you know that cut?" she asked. "I know every cut in this pass," he said. He picked up their pace slightly, not obviously, not in a way that would read as running, just enough to give them more distance from the switchback. Henry had moved up beside Silas without comment, which was the first time he'd done that voluntarily. "How many places can they take the high ground?" he asked. Silas looked at him, just briefly, but Martha caught it. That same quality of assessment he'd given her on the platform. 2, Silas said. "The cut we're coming through and the ridge at the top of the 3rd switchback. So if they're moving to get ahead of us, they're already too late for the cut," Silas said. The top ridge is the concern. He was right. Martha could see the math of it, even without knowing the terrain. 3 riders moving fast on a parallel line could reach the third switchback ridge ahead of them if they cut through the trees to the right, which looked passable. She could see them doing it in her mind and felt her stomach go tight. "Henry," Silas said, "when I tell you to, you take the pack horse and your mother, and you go to the left shoulder of the trail. There's a rock outcrop. You stay behind it." "I'm not," Henry started. "You're keeping your mother and the supplies safe," Silas said. "That's not a lesser job." Henry's jaw locked. He looked at his mother. "He's right," Martha said quietly. Henry looked back at the riders behind them. His jaw stayed locked, but he nodded. They came around the top of the third switchback, and there they were. 4 men. Not 3. A fourth had come from somewhere, maybe from a position already established, because he was on foot at the edge of the trail with a rifle in the crook of his arm and an expression that had clearly worked on people before. The other 3 had come around through the trees, which was exactly what Silas had predicted, and were positioned across the trail on horseback, blocking the way forward. The man on foot was large, carrying the weight of someone who'd been hard once and had softened at the edges without losing the underlying structure. His coat was heavy, dark-furred at the collar, and he wore it open despite the cold, which was either a statement or stupidity. His face was wide and had been rearranged a few times, nose broken and rebroken, a ridge along the left eye socket that said it had been cracked at some point. He had a beard that hadn't been attended to in months, and small, pale eyes that moved between Silas and Martha with an assessment that made her want to move her horse sideways. "Silas Crow," the man said. His voice was bigger than she'd expected, carrying easily across the cold air. "Heard you were bringing something interesting back from Red Hollow." "Rufus," Silas said. One word, the same way he used most words. Flat, without ceremony, giving nothing away. So he knew him. Martha filed that. Rufus Kane. Because this was who he was, she understood that without being told, the same way you understand certain things about certain people within the first 30 seconds of their presence, looked at Martha with those pale eyes, and then at Henry. And his expression was the expression of a man making calculations of his own. "Didn't know you were taking on family arrangements," Rufus said. "Doesn't seem like your style." "What I do isn't your business, Rufus." "Oh, I don't know about that." Rufus took a few steps toward them, not fast, not threatening in any dramatic way. Just the slow, steady movement of someone who'd learned that slow and steady was more unnerving than fast. "I've got a business proposition you might want to hear." "I'm going to decline without hearing it," Silas said. Rufus smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, which stayed exactly as pale and calculating as before. "Woman and 7 children, Silas. That's a significant burden for a man running a solo operation." He paused. "I can help you with that." The cold went from being a physical condition to being something else entirely, something that lived along the back of Martha's neck and had nothing to do with temperature. She felt Henry beside her go very still. "Get off the trail," Silas said. "I'm offering to—" "I heard what you're offering." Silas's voice had changed by 1 degree, but that degree was significant. "Get off the trail." Rufus looked at him for a long moment. The smile was still there, but it had changed quality, gone from performed to something more honest and considerably less pleasant. "You always were a difficult man to do business with," he said. "That Cutter Briggs situation notwithstanding. Move your men." "See, here's my position," Rufus said, like Silas hadn't spoken. "I'm going to need you to step down off that horse, and then we're going to have a different kind of conversation." He glanced at the rifle he was carrying with the deliberate casualness of someone who wants you to notice it without them having to raise it. "The woman and the boy can—" Silas was off his horse before Rufus finished the sentence. Not falling, controlled, fast, a single motion that put him on the ground between Button and the nearest of Rufus's mounted men, and then the mounted man's horse was shying sideways because Silas had his bridle, and the man was cursing and trying to control the animal, and everything happened at once. Martha grabbed Henry's arm. "Rock outcrop," she said. "Now." "But now, Henry." She didn't wait to see if he moved. She had her horse moving left toward the shoulder of the trail, pulling the pack horse behind her, and she got to the rocks, a low outcrop of granite that jutted out of the hillside like a shoulder, and pulled up hard and turned to look back. What she saw was not a clean fight. She'd half expected it to be. She'd half constructed, without realizing it, some idea of Silas Crow as someone who handled things efficiently and came out right every time, the way his manner implied a certain inevitability to his competence. But this was not that. There were 4 men and 1 of him, and numbers were numbers regardless of competence. He'd gotten the first mounted man off his horse. She didn't see exactly how, but the man was on the ground and not getting up quickly, which meant Silas had done something definitive to at least one of the problems. A second rider came hard from the right, and Silas turned to meet him but was a half-second slow, and the man caught him across the shoulder with something. A club, a rifle stock, she couldn't tell. And Silas staggered. Henry made a sound beside her that was not language. She grabbed his arm again. "Don't," she said. I see it. Don't." Silas had recovered from the shoulder hit and put the second man's horse into the trail barrier on the uphill side, which bought a few seconds. But Rufus had moved in close while Silas was occupied with the horses, and he was not, it turned out, just carrying that rifle for show. He swung its stock first, and it connected with Silas's side. Ribs, the sound of it carried across the cold air in a way Martha's stomach turned at, and Silas went down to one knee. The whole thing went quiet for a moment in the way of a fight that's reached a decision point. Rufus stood over Silas with the rifle in his hands, and his 2 remaining men positioned behind him, and the man whose horse Silas had diverted was coming back around the bend with an expression that had moved well past calculation into something more personal. "You know," Rufus said, breathing hard, "you've been the most stubborn man in this territory for 15 years, and I have got to say, Crow, I am tired of working around you." Silas was still on one knee. His hand was pressed against his side where the stock had connected. His head was down, but only for a moment. He brought it up and looked at Rufus, and his expression was not the expression of a man who had given up. It was the expression of a man who was thinking. "The woman," Rufus said to his man, with the casual authority of someone accustomed to giving instructions. "Bring her." Martha was already moving. She hadn't decided. That was the strangest thing about it, after. There was no moment of deliberation, no weighing of options, no courage summoned from somewhere deep. One second she was holding Henry's arm, and the next she was not, and she was off the outcrop and back on the trail, and her horse was moving at a pace she hadn't asked for consciously, but had apparently communicated through some means she wasn't aware of. Rufus's man turned to face her, which meant he was not facing Henry, which meant he didn't see Henry come off the outcrop behind her. She hit the man at speed, not gracefully, not with any technique or skill. She came off the horse directly into him the way a wall of weather comes into a plain. Mass and momentum and no particular plan beyond the direction she was heading. They both went down in the snow, and she landed badly, her knee hitting something hard under the surface. And the man was larger than her and stronger, but she'd taken him entirely by surprise, and she had the particular advantage of someone who has absolutely nothing left to lose. She got one hand on his collar, and with the other she reached for the rifle that had come loose in the fall. He grabbed her wrist. She twisted. He cursed. She got 2 fingers on the stock and pulled. From behind her she heard a sound that was Henry and one of the other men, and she couldn't look. She could only stay with what was directly in front of her, which was this man's grip on her wrist and this rifle between them, and she pulled again, and he pulled back, and she did something she'd done exactly once before in her life. In a barn in Red Hollow, when a hand had cornered her a year after Thomas died. She brought her forehead down onto his nose. The crunch was ugly. The man made a sound that was also ugly. His grip on her wrist loosened. She got the rifle. She got to her feet. Her knee screamed. She ignored it with the ferocious capacity of a person under enough adrenaline to not yet care. Rufus had turned from Silas. He was looking at her. She was standing in the snow on a mountain trail with a stolen rifle in her hands and blood on her forehead from a headbutt that had hurt her almost as much as it had hurt him, and she was breathing so hard she could see every breath in the cold air, rapid and white. "Put that down," Rufus said. "No," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those pale eyes. He looked at the rifle. He did the calculation. Henry had the other man. She could hear the struggle behind her and then the specific sound of it ending, and then Henry's voice, tight and controlled. "I've got him." Silas was up. She didn't see it happen, but he was up, and the way he moved now was different from before. The calculated stillness was gone, replaced by something that was not quite the same thing as fury, but was in the same building. He crossed the distance between himself and Rufus in fewer steps than should have been possible and had his hand on the man's collar before Rufus fully registered it was happening. "Call them off," Silas said. Rufus looked at him. "You're cracked," he said. "At least 2 ribs." "Call them off." Rufus looked at Martha, at the rifle, at Henry behind her, at the man sitting in the snow holding his nose, at the first man still not up, at his remaining mounted man, who was doing the same calculation Rufus was doing and clearly arriving at a similar conclusion. "We're done here," Rufus said, and it took Martha a moment to realize he was talking to his own men. His voice had changed. The big, carrying confidence of it was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. "We're done." The mounted man turned his horse. The man on the ground, not the one with the broken nose, the first one, got up slowly and looked at Silas with an expression that made a decision about the future. The man with the broken nose was helped up by nobody, because nobody helped him, and he got his feet under him and moved away with the careful dignity of someone trying to preserve what little of it remained. Rufus looked at Silas for a long moment. Then he looked at Martha. "That was stupid," he said to her. It could have been an insult. The way he said it, it wasn't. It was something closer to honest acknowledgement, the kind you give something that surprised you. "Walk away," Martha said. Her voice was steady. She didn't understand why it was steady. Her hands were shaking. She could feel them shaking against the rifle stock, but her voice was not. Rufus held her eyes for one more moment, those pale, calculated eyes, and then something moved through them that was not defeat exactly, but was the nearest available thing, and he turned and walked back to his horse and got on it and rode back around the bend without another word. The sound of hoofbeats faded, and then there was just the mountain and the wind and the cold, and Martha standing in the snow with a rifle she was now holding entirely too tight. Henry was beside her. She didn't hear him come. He was just suddenly there, close enough that she could have leaned on him if she needed to, which she did not, but the proximity mattered. "Mama," he said, just that. "I'm all right," she said. Her knee was beginning to inform her that this might not be entirely accurate. "I'm all right." She lowered the rifle and turned to look at Silas. He was standing 8 feet away, one hand still pressed against his side. His coat was open, his hat was somewhere in the snow, and there was a cut along his jaw. New, not the old scar below it, that was bleeding with the steady patience of cuts that aren't immediately serious but intend to be noticed. He was looking at her. She looked back. His expression was doing something she hadn't seen from him before. Not the small settling she'd come to know, not the careful assessment, not the close-held stillness. Something else. Something that looked like a man who has seen a thing he wasn't prepared for and doesn't yet have a category for it. "Your head," he said. She reached up. There was blood above her eyebrow from the headbutt. She hadn't noticed. "It's not mine," she said. Then she recalibrated. "Mostly not mine." Silas looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Henry. "You're not hurt?" Henry checked himself with a briefly incredulous expression, like it was a novel experience to be asked that. "No," he said. "I'm not hurt." Silas picked up his hat from the snow. He pressed his hand against his ribs again, testing, and the breath that came through his teeth told her what she'd already suspected. "We need to get you back," she said. "I've had worse. That's not what I asked." She walked to him. She put her hand out without thinking, then stopped. She wasn't sure what the gesture was supposed to be. She wasn't sure of the language yet, the specific vocabulary of whatever they were to each other. He looked down at her hand, then at her face. He looked at the blood above her eyebrow, at the way she was slightly favoring her left knee, at the rifle still in her other hand. "I had 4 men," he said. "I've handled 4 men before." "I know," she said. "You didn't need to." "I know," she said again. "I didn't do it because I thought you needed me to." He waited. "I did it because I wasn't going to stand behind a rock," she said. "Not while someone was—" She stopped. She thought about what to say. She thought about the platform, and the 42 men, and the strip of pale sky between the buildings, and Tobias's face that morning before the wagon came. Not while someone was threatening what's mine. The last word landed in the cold air between them. Silas held her eyes for a long time. She didn't look away. "All right," he said finally. The same word he'd said when she'd looked back at the valley and then faced forward. The word that meant, "I see you." I hear it. We move. He took a breath and didn't wince at it, which she suspected cost him something. He put his hat back on. We go home, he said. They collected the horses. They collected the pack horse, who had stood through the entire thing with the philosophical patience of an animal that had decided the humans were in charge of whatever this was. Henry untied him without comment and brought him back to the trail. The three of them moved out together, back the way they'd come. Through the cut in the ridge, down the long switchback, toward the valley. Martha rode with her knee aching and her head beginning to throb and the rifle across her saddle, and she didn't say much, and neither did Silas or Henry. And the mountain held its silence around them the same way it always held its silence, impartial and enormous and utterly indifferent to what had happened on its trail. But halfway down the last switchback, Henry pulled his horse up beside Silas. Silas looked at him. Henry was quiet for a moment. He had the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time to say something, not because the words were complicated, but because the right moment was, and who has now found the moment whether he wanted to or not. My father, Henry said slowly, used to say that a man who doesn't stand and fight for his people isn't worth standing next to. He paused. A long pause. I think you're worth standing next to. Silas looked at the trail ahead. Thank you, Henry, he said, quiet and exact. Henry nodded once. He pulled his horse back to ride beside his mother. Martha looked at her son, this 14-year-old boy with Thomas's jaw and something in his eyes that was entirely his own. And she felt the thing she often felt about Clara, the thing without a clean word for it, that combination of pride and sorrow and overwhelming, complicated love. She reached over and put her hand briefly on his shoulder. He let her. They rode the rest of the way down in silence, and the valley opened up below them with its frozen creek and its tall pines and its smoke-trailing chimneys, and it looked exactly the way it had the first time she'd seen it, solid and real and entirely its own thing. Home, her chest said, without asking her permission. She let it. Abe knew something was wrong before they came through the gate. He'd been in the south pasture checking the fence line when he heard the horses, and there was something in the rhythm of them, too slow, too careful, the particular gait of animals being managed by riders who are managing something else at the same time, that brought him to the fence rail and kept him there watching until they came into view around the tree line. 3 riders, 2 pack animals, everyone upright, which was the first thing he checked, because that was the first thing you checked. Then he saw the blood on Martha's face, and Silas's hand pressed against his side, and the expression on Henry's face, which was the expression of a boy who'd been somewhere a boy shouldn't have to go and had come back from it carrying the weight of it. And Abe said one short, flat word to himself and started moving toward the barn. By the time they reached the yard, Peter was coming out of the forge shed and read the same information from the same set of signals and went immediately back inside for the medicine kit without being asked. Clara appeared in the doorway of the house. She had a sense for when something had shifted. Clara did, an attunement to it that Martha had noticed long before Red Hollow and had never been able to fully explain. And she stood in the doorway and looked at her mother and her brother and Silas, and her face went very still. What happened? She said. We're all right, Martha said, dismounting. Her knee buckled slightly when she hit the ground, and she caught herself on the saddle and straightened before anyone could offer help. Clara came down the porch steps. She looked at her mother's forehead, at the dried blood above the eyebrow. She looked at it for a long moment with an expression that was neither panic nor indifference, but something exactly between them. The expression of a 12-year-old who has learned that panic is not useful and has trained herself out of it, which is not the same as not feeling it. You should sit down, Clara said. I'll sit down inside, Martha said. Where are the little ones? Kitchen with Annie. Tobias is asleep. Clara's eyes went to Silas, who was working on getting off his horse with a controlled deliberateness that made his injury obvious to anyone who knew how he normally moved. How bad? She said to him directly. Silas looked at her, briefly surprised, which was the effect Clara often had on people who weren't used to her. Manageable, he said. That's what you said about the ice on the trail, Clara said, right before the wheel went sideways. Silas got his feet on the ground. He stood for a moment with one hand on Button's flank, and something moved across his face that was not quite humor, but was in the same neighborhood. 2 ribs, he said. Possibly. Not broken through. Peter's getting the kit, Abe said. appearing at Silas's other side with the wordless efficiency of a man who'd worked alongside someone long enough to know what was needed before it was asked for. "Come inside." "The horses first," Silas said. "I've got the horses," Abe said. "Come inside, Silas." There was a particular quality to the way Abe said his employer's name in that moment. Not with any particular softness, because Abe wasn't a soft man, but with the authority of someone who'd earned the right to override the stubbornness on the grounds of having seen it do damage before. Silas looked at him. Then he went inside. The kitchen became the place where everything happened for the next hour, the way kitchens do in houses where something has gone wrong. People moving in and out of it, the stove working, the table pressed into service as a triage point. Peter laid out the medicine kit with surprising organization for someone who seemed, in most other respects, to be perpetually mid-chaos. Martha sat on the bench along the wall and let Clara clean the cut on her forehead, which was shallow and had already stopped bleeding but looked considerably worse than it was, which she suspected was going to be the subject of conversation for longer than she'd prefer. Silas sat at the table with his shirt open while Peter assessed his ribs with hands that were more practiced than his age suggested, pressing carefully along the right side of his rib cage, while Silas breathed with controlled evenness. "You've done this before," Martha said, watching Peter work. "His father was a doctor," Silas said, through a carefully managed exhale, as Peter found the worst of it. "Was?" Martha said. "Is," Peter said. "He's in Pemberton. I just didn't want to be." He pressed one more point, and Silas's jaw locked for a half-second. "Not broken through," Peter said. "Cracked, maybe. 1 or 2. He sat back. "You need to not do anything stupid for 6 weeks. "Define stupid," Silas said. "I feel like you know what stupid is," Peter said. "In my experience, stupid is relative to the situation." "In my experience," Peter said, in the tone of someone older than 20, "men who define stupid as relative to the situation are the ones who end up with broken ribs that don't heal right and then complain about them for the rest of their lives." He began wrapping a length of cloth around Silas's torso with efficiency. "Hold still." Silas held still. His eyes went across the kitchen to Martha. She was watching him. She'd been watching him intermittently since they came inside, which she was aware of and not entirely sure what to do about. Clara had finished with her forehead and gone to tell Annie, Thoughts and the twins, that everything was fine, and in the brief absence of something to do with her hands, Martha found she didn't know quite where to put herself. She was not unacquainted with violence. She'd grown up on a farm. She'd seen animals hurt. She'd dealt with the particular violence of poverty and circumstance and the slow grinding kind that comes from a life that isn't easy. But the fast kind, the sudden and physical and personal kind, was something different. She could still feel the shape of it in her body, the specific terror of seeing Silas go down on one knee, the thing that had happened in her chest in the second before she moved, the way her hands had been shaking against the rifle stock without her permission. The adrenaline had burned off somewhere on the trail home. What it left behind was a specific gray exhaustion and a throbbing in her knee and her forehead and a thought that kept circling back regardless of what she tried to replace it with. Rufus Kane knows where this valley is. He knows where this ranch is. He's going to come back. She didn't say this out loud because there were children in the house, and it was already evening, and the day had already been what it had been. But Silas, she noticed, was looking at her with an expression that said he was thinking the same thing. Henry appeared in his doorway. He'd dealt with the horses, apparently, because there was hay on his coat, and he'd been crying. She could see it in the redness around his eyes, the slight swollenness, though his face now was composed and dry. He'd cried privately, and he'd come back from it, and he wasn't going to acknowledge it. She wasn't going to acknowledge it either. Some things needed the privacy of not being named. "The horses are settled," he said. "Abe's finishing up." "Thank you," Silas said. Henry came into the kitchen and sat down on the bench beside his mother. He sat close enough that their shoulders touched, which was something he hadn't done in 2 years. Not since the week Thomas died, when he'd sat beside her exactly like this. And she'd understood without either of them saying it that they were holding each other up by proximity, by the simple animal comfort of not being physically alone. She felt it now the same way she'd felt it then. She didn't move away from it. Annie appeared behind Henry with Tobias on her hip, both of them looking at the tableau in the kitchen with the slightly formal attention of children who know something happened and are trying to calibrate how worried to be. "Mama," Tobias said, "you have blood on your head." "I had a small accident," Martha said. Tobias studied her with the deep seriousness of a 4-year-old conducting an assessment. "Does it hurt?" "A little." He wiggled free of Annie's hip and crossed the kitchen and climbed onto the bench on Martha's other side with the single-minded determination of a child who has decided where he needs to be, and he pressed himself against her side and put his small hand over the hand in her lap. She looked down at it. His hand was so small. It still surprised her sometimes, the smallness of it. "Better?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Much." Across the kitchen, Silas was watching this. Peter had finished wrapping his ribs and was packing up the kit, and Silas was sitting at the table with his shirt still open and his hands flat on the table surface. And he was watching Tobias's hand over Martha's with an expression she couldn't fully read from here, but that had a quality to it she hadn't seen from him before today. Something open. Something that had not been there 3 weeks ago. She thought about what he'd said in the cabin in the dark. I missed that part most, actually. Someone who argued back. She thought about Eleanor, small and arguing, who had believed he was going to build something worth building. She thought about 6 years alone in this house, in this valley, with 2 hired men and several hundred acres and 9 rooms that he'd stopped counting before he was finished. She thought about the platform in Red Hollow and the way he'd watched her from the edge of the crowd for 40 minutes before he walked forward. She was starting, slowly, to understand the shape of his decision. Not all of it, but the beginning of it. The twins materialized at the kitchen door behind Annie, having apparently been somewhere in the back of the house conducting their usual private business. James looked at Silas's wrapped ribs and said, "What does the other guy look like?" "James," Martha said. "It's a reasonable question," James said. "The other guys," Henry said, with a slight emphasis on the plural, "left with significantly more damage than they came with." James and Joseph exchanged a look. Joseph said, "How many?" "4," Henry said. Another look exchanged. Then James said to Silas, with the directness of a 12-year-old who hasn't yet learned to soften things, "Could you not take 4 of them?" "I was working on it," Silas said. "Mama helped," Tobias announced, from his position pressed against Martha's side. He hadn't been there. He was reporting what he'd apparently been told in the last 5 minutes by someone, probably Annie. "She knocked a man down." James and Joseph turned to look at their mother. Martha said nothing. "You knocked a man down?" Joseph said. "I knocked a man down," she confirmed. The twins looked at each other again, and in that twin language look exchanged something that Martha couldn't fully translate, but which resulted in both of them nodding in a way that suggested approval was being issued, which was, she wasn't sure what that was. It was something. Clara came back into the kitchen. She'd been gone long enough to have done something purposeful, and she had the slightly abstracted air of someone who has been thinking hard about a practical problem. She looked at Silas. "Rufus Kane," she said. The kitchen went quiet in a particular way. "How do you know that name?" Silas asked. "Abe," Clara said simply. "I asked him who would be on that trail with intent, and he said the name." She paused. "He also said Kane has been running operations in the Eastern Pass for 3 years, and that you've had friction before, and that he has 7 men total, 4 of whom you encountered today." She paused again. "I asked follow-up questions." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "You asked Abe follow-up questions." "He answered them," Clara said, with a slight lift of her chin. "So the question is what Kane is going to do next. Because men like that—" She stopped, and something moved across her face that was adult and also not. That was the particular quality of a child who has seen enough of the world to have formed accurate theories about it. Men like that don't walk away because they want to. They walk away because they have to recalculate. And then they come back. The kitchen was very quiet. Peter had stopped packing up the kit. Abe, who had come in from the barn during Clara's accounting, was standing in the doorway with his coat still on and snow on his boots and no expression on his face, which with Abe meant he was listening seriously. Silas said to Clara, "You're right." Clara received this the way she received most confirmations, by nodding once and moving to the next thing. "So what do we do?" "Clara," Martha started. She's asking the right question, Silas said. He looked at Martha. She's right that he'll come back. He won't do it on the trail again. He lost that ground. He'll come to the valley. When? Henry asked. Not tonight. He needs to regroup, and Kane doesn't move without organizing first. It's his only real quality. He paused. We have a few days, maybe a week. Then we should use them, Henry said. Martha looked at her son. Henry, I'm not saying anything reckless, Henry said. I'm saying we have time and we should use it. He looked at Silas. What does the ranch need to be defensible? The word defensible sat in the air of the kitchen. Silas looked at Henry for a moment. Then he looked at Martha. She had the sense he was waiting for something from her. Not permission exactly, but something. An orientation, some indication of where she stood. She thought about the platform. She thought about Tobias's hand over hers. She thought about the word she'd said on the trail, mine. Tell us what you need, she said to Silas. He told them. It took the better part of an hour, and when he was finished there was a list that was both practical and sobering. The front approach needed to be visible from the main house, which meant taking down 2 sections of the east fence to open the sight line. The barn had a position on its upper level that covered the gate approach. The South Creek crossing was the only other viable entry point and needed someone on it. The rifles they had between them numbered 3, plus Thomas's shotgun that Martha had brought from Red Hollow, plus a 4th that Abe had in his quarters and hadn't mentioned until now. That's not enough for 7 men if they come organized, Abe said. No, Silas agreed. It's not. He paused. But we're not going to win this by having more firepower. We're going to win it by making him decide the cost isn't worth it. How? Henry asked. Kane is a businessman, Silas said. He's not a true believer in anything. Not vengeance, not principle, not territory. He operates on calculation. What he calculated today was that I was a single man with a new family and no backup, which made me a manageable problem. He paused. We need to change his calculation. How? Henry said again. We make this place look like what it is, Silas said. A working ranch with capable people who know their land and aren't going anywhere. He looked around the kitchen. All of them. All of us. Martha understood before he finished saying it. You mean visible, she said. You mean make it clear there's not one person here to run. There's a household. A household that isn't afraid of him, Silas said, specifically. We're not afraid of him, Tobias said from Martha's side. He'd been so quiet in the last few minutes that she'd almost forgotten he was there, but now he lifted his head and delivered this verdict with absolute 4-year-old certainty. Are we, Mama? Martha looked down at her youngest child. She thought about Rufus Kane's pale, calculating eyes. She thought about his voice saying the woman like she was an item on a list. She thought about her forehead and Silas's ribs and Henry's red eyes and the trail and the sound of the rifle stock hitting Silas's side. No, she said. We're not. The next 4 days were the hardest work Martha had done since the months immediately after Thomas died. The east fence came down in sections under Henry and Peter's management, which opened the sight line from the kitchen window all the way to the gate. Abe repositioned a set of storage crates in the barn's upper level to create cover points that looked from below like ordinary organization. The creek crossing got checked twice daily, which fell to Clara. She'd asked for the job with the specific practicality of someone who understood that useful work was the best available response to waiting, and nobody argued with her. Martha managed the house and the children and the cooking and the 1,000 other small things that kept 9 people functioning in winter, and she did it while her knee ached and her forehead healed and her mind ran the calculations she wasn't talking out loud about because there was no useful version of saying them out loud. She'd become quite good, over the years, at doing 2 things at once, at managing the surface of a situation while the deeper part of her mind worked on the thing underneath it. Thomas had called it her second river. You've got 2 rivers running, he'd say. The one I can see and the one I can't. The one she couldn't see was running fast these days. On the second day after the incident on the trail, Silas found her in the barn late in the afternoon, after the children were occupied with supper preparations, and Abe and Peter were at the south fence. She was checking the horses the way she did every evening, moving through the stalls with the quiet efficiency of someone who finds animal company easier than human company at the end of a hard day. He came in and stood at the entrance for a moment without saying anything. She didn't stop what she was doing. How are your ribs? She said. Present, he said. That's not an answer. It's a truthful one. He came further into the barn. He was moving better than he had on the trail home, though she could still see the compensation in the way he carried his right side. Martha. She looked up. He used her name rarely, she'd noticed. When he did, it meant he was about to say something he'd been working on. On the trail, he said. What you did. You're going to tell me it was reckless, she said. It was reckless, he said. That's not what I was going to say. She waited. I've been alone in this valley for 6 years, he said. He said it the same way he'd said Eleanor's name. To the middle distance, not quite to her, as if it needed a slightly indirect angle to come out. I built it alone and I've run it alone and I've had 2 good men here, but that's... He paused. That's not the same thing. That's not... Another pause. I'm not saying this well. You're saying it fine, she said. He looked at her. On that platform in Red Hollow, he said, I watched 42 men walk away from you, and I watched you stand there and take it, and I watched your face, and... He stopped. There wasn't self-pity in it. There wasn't performance. You were just... He looked for the word. Enduring. Like the mountain endures, just standing in it. Martha didn't say anything. I knew then, he said. I'd been watching for 2 months at different settlement events across the territory, looking for... I don't know what I was looking for. Competence, maybe. Someone who could manage this place. That's what I told myself. He paused. But watching you on that platform, I understood it wasn't competence. It was something harder than that. He looked at his hands briefly. It was someone who doesn't break. The barn was quiet around them. One of the horses shifted in its stall. The light through the high window was going orange and flat. I break, Martha said. I've broken. Plenty of times. I didn't say you don't bend, he said. I said you don't break. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the boarding house floor between the 2 trunks. She thought about the nights the first winter after Thomas died, when she'd lain in the dark and felt something in her chest that she was genuinely not certain she would survive. Not because she wanted to die, but because grief at that intensity seemed to exceed the structural capacity of a person, seemed to require more room than a body had. She'd survived it by moving, by getting up in the morning and doing the next thing and then the next thing and never, ever stopping for long enough to see the full bottom of what she was standing over. Maybe that wasn't breaking. Maybe Silas had named something real. Why did you wait? She said. It was the same question she'd asked on the platform, and he'd given her an answer then. I wanted to see if you'd hold. But she understood now that there was another layer to it. He understood the question differently this time, too. He took a moment with it. Because I was afraid, he said, simply, without apology or performance. I had a life here that worked. Not well, not fully, but it worked. And bringing in, he gestured vaguely, all of this, another gesture, is the end of the life that worked, even if it worked poorly. You can't go back from it. No, she said. You can't. I needed to be certain, he said, about the kind of person, before I couldn't go back. She looked at him. And were you certain? On the platform, he said, when I came up the steps. He paused. Yes. She held that for a moment. Silas, she said. He looked at her. The reason I got off that rock on the trail. She stopped. She thought about how to say it. She thought about the second river, the one Thomas could never see. It wasn't courage. I want you to know that. It wasn't some quality I have. It was... She searched for the honest version of it. It was terror, she said. A specific kind. The kind that moves you instead of freezing you. I don't know if that's a virtue or just a type of fear. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, the one where he's processing something that doesn't fit his existing system, working to make room for it. In my experience, he said slowly, the people who tell you they weren't afraid are the ones you can't trust. The ones who say they were, and did it anyway. He paused. Those are the ones worth standing next to. It was Henry's phrase. He'd said it to Silas on the trail, and now Silas was saying it back, and she wondered if he was aware of that, or if it had simply settled into him the same way true things settle, without announcement, just taking up residence. I think we're both afraid of what comes next, she said. Yes, he said, but we're going to do it anyway. Yes, he said. She nodded. He nodded. It was not a romantic moment. There was manure on her boots and his ribs were cracked, and neither of them was the kind of person who arrived at moments cleanly. But something had been said that needed saying, and the barn was quiet, and outside the valley was going to blue dusk in the way it did every evening, the light coming off the snow turning everything the specific color of cold beauty. Come eat, she said, before the twins consume everything and leave nothing for the rest of us. Something moved across his face. She'd learned to catch it when it happened. That small, involuntary thing. Peter bet James 4 fence nails that he couldn't eat 3 helpings, Silas said. This was before supper started. James will take that bet and win it, Martha said. I know, Silas said. I told Peter that. Did Peter listen? Peter never listens, Silas said. It's his defining quality. She almost laughed. She was getting closer to actually laughing. The almost was getting thinner. They walked back to the house together through the cold blue dusk, not touching, not particularly close, but moving at the same pace, which was its own kind of thing, its own quiet language. Behind the lit windows of the house, someone was arguing about something. She could hear it from here, the muffled rise and fall of it. Too many voices to track individually. It sounded like her children. It sounded like home. The 3rd day after the trail passed, and the 4th, and on the 5th morning, Abe came in from the south fence with a report that there had been riders on the far ridge, watching. 3 of them. Not moving toward the valley, just watching. Silas received this information at the breakfast table without visible reaction. Martha received it beside him and kept eating, which was a decision she made with full awareness that the children were watching both of them. Should we be worried? Annie asked. We should be prepared, Silas said, which we are. Annie looked at Martha. Martha looked back at her steadily. Okay, Annie said. She went back to her breakfast. Henry looked at Silas. A long look. Silas met it. They're not coming yet, he said, answering the question Henry hadn't asked out loud. Kane is watching, counting, reassessing. He paused. Let him count. What will he count? Henry asked. Silas looked around the table. All of them, 9 people. 2 of them hired men who'd been here 6 years and showed no signs of going anywhere. 7 of them new and various sizes and ages, but all of them, in this moment, sitting at the same table, in the same house, on the same land. Everything, Silas said. That's exactly what I want him to count. The riders on the ridge were gone by afternoon. They didn't come back that day, or the next. Martha didn't know what it meant, and she understood that not knowing was part of what this was. This specific strain of waiting that was neither peace nor crisis, but the narrow corridor between them. She lived in that corridor and kept moving. That was the only thing she'd ever known how to do. Kane came on the 7th day, which was either longer than expected or exactly as long as it needed to be, depending on how you counted. He came at dawn, which was the obvious time. The hour when light was ambiguous and people were slowest and the cold had its deepest grip on everything. Martha had been awake for an hour already, the way she'd been awake before dawn every day for the past week, lying in the dark with her second river running fast and her ears tuned to the valley, the way you tune to a sick child in the next room. That specific alertness that doesn't feel like being awake so much as being perpetually on the threshold of it. She heard the gate before anyone else did. Not a sound exactly, more the absence of one. The particular silence that replaces the ordinary sounds of a place when something enters it that doesn't belong. She was dressed and out the bedroom door before she'd consciously decided to move, and she nearly collided with Silas in the hallway, who had apparently heard the same absence at the same moment. They looked at each other in the dark. Gate, she said. Yes, he said. Henry was already at the window at the end of the hall, looking out. 5 of them, he said quietly, coming in through the main approach, slow. South crossing? Silas asked. Abe's there, Martha said. She'd confirmed it an hour ago because she'd been unable to stop herself from checking. Silas moved to the front window. Martha was beside him. In the gray pre-dawn light, she could see them. 5 riders coming up the approach through the open sight line that Henry and Peter had created by taking down the east fence sections. The fence removal had been tactical, and it had worked exactly as intended. The riders were visible from 200 yards out. exposed, with no cover between the gate and the house. They were moving slowly because they were reading that exposure and not liking it. "He's being careful," Henry said. "He's always careful," Silas said. "It's why he's lasted this long." Martha could see Rufus Kane in the front, that wide, rearranged face, that heavy coat with the fur collar. He was riding with his head moving slightly, scanning the house, the barn, the yard, counting, calculating, exactly what Silas had said he would do. He stopped his group about 60 yards from the house. "Crow," he called. His voice carried easily in the cold morning air. "I think we should talk." Silas looked at Martha. She nodded once. He opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, and Martha came with him. And behind them she heard the quiet movement of Henry taking position at the window. And from the barn's upper level she knew Peter was there. And at the south crossing, Abe was there. And whatever happened in the next 10 minutes, Rufus Kane was not looking at one man on a trail. He was looking at something else entirely. She watched him understand that. She watched it move across his face in the early light, the recalibration, the reassessment, the arithmetic being revised. "Rufus," Silas said. His voice was level and carried exactly as far as it needed to. "You're on my land." "I'm aware of that," Rufus said. His eyes moved from Silas to Martha and back. "I came to make a reasonable offer." "Your last reasonable offer put me on one knee," Silas said. "I'm not interested in another one." "Things were poorly handled," Rufus said. Not an apology. A Kane would not apologize. Martha understood that from 30 seconds of watching him. But a concession. An acknowledgement that the calculation had been wrong. "I acted on incomplete information." What information was incomplete? Rufus's pale eyes moved to Martha again. She held them. She did not look away, and she did not arrange her face into anything conciliatory because she had decided on the porch this morning that she was done with conciliation as a first language. "I understood you to be alone," Rufus said to Silas. He was still looking at Martha. "I see that was incorrect." "Significantly incorrect," Silas said. Rufus shifted on his horse. His men were behind him, and Martha could see that 2 of them were the men from the trail. The one with the broken nose, whose face was a dramatic landscape of bruising at this point, and the man whose shoulder Silas had done something definitive to, who was sitting his horse at a careful angle. Both of them were looking at Martha with expressions that were not precisely respectful, but had traveled a considerable distance from their previous contempt. "What is it you want, Rufus?" Silas said. "Plain." Rufus was quiet for a moment. The early light was growing, the valley coming into definition around them. The frozen creek, the tall pines, the snow-covered pastures, the smoke beginning to rise from the house's chimneys. A working ranch on a winter morning, exactly as it was, exactly as it had always been. Except now there were 9 people in it instead of 1. "The Eastern Pass operation," Rufus said. "I want Crow Valley's South Crossing left out of county reporting." Martha heard Silas make a small sound beside her that was not agreement. "You've been running goods through the South Crossing for 2 years," Silas said. "On my land, without my knowledge or permission." "Without your interference," Rufus corrected. The pale eyes were careful now, watchful, which was acceptable to both parties. "It was acceptable to you," Silas said. "I didn't know about it." A beat of silence. "Now you do," Rufus said. Martha understood the shape of it now. Kane had been using the South Crossing, the secondary entry to the valley, the one Abe patrolled now, as a passage point for whatever he was moving through the Eastern Territory. The ranch's isolation had made it useful. Silas's singleness had made it safe. And when Silas had come back from Red Hollow with a family, with more eyes, with a household that extended in all directions, Rufus had felt his operation threatened and had responded the way he responded to threats. This was not, she realized, about her children. It had never been about her children specifically. They'd been leverage, a complication, an argument for clearing the obstacle rather than working around it. She was surprised by how much colder she went when she understood that. Not frightened, past frightened, into something harder. "Here's what I'll offer you," Silas said. "You take your men off my land this morning. You close whatever operation you're running through the South Crossing. Close it completely. Move it somewhere I don't know about and don't care about. And I don't ride to the county seat and file a full report on 3 years of unauthorized land use and whatever else you've been moving through here. Rufus looked at him. That's not a negotiation, Rufus said. That's a surrender. Yes, Silas said. The words sat in the cold morning air between them, flat and final, and entirely without drama. Rufus looked at Martha again. She thought he was going to say something to her directly, some attempt to find a different angle, some calculation about which person at this door was the weaker point of entry. She could see him considering it. She spoke before he could. Mr. Kane, she said. He shifted his attention to her fully. I was a widow with 7 children and no options, and I still didn't fold on a platform in Red Hollow while 42 men walked away from me. She kept her voice even. She'd had 6 days of waiting to work out what she would say if this moment came, and what she'd landed on was not a speech, just the plainest version of the truth. This is my home. These are my children, and I have been scared for every single day of the past 2 years, and I am tired of it. She paused. I am done being scared. Not of hard winters, not of difficult men, not of you. So whatever calculation you're running right now about whether there's a softer entry point at this door, there isn't. Take your men and go. The valley was very quiet. One of Kane's men in the back shifted on his horse. The man with the broken nose looked at the ground. The one with the bad shoulder looked at the barn's upper level, where Peter was, and then at the south where Abe was, and then at the house where Henry was. And Martha watched him do the math and come out on the wrong side of it. Rufus Kane looked at her for a long time. She thought about the auction platform. She thought about the strip of pale sky between the buildings in Red Hollow, the thing she'd fixed her eyes on while the men walked away. She thought about Thomas's photograph in the oilcloth and Tobias's hand over hers and Clara arguing about Chapter 7 and Henry on the trail saying worth standing next to. She thought about a woman who doesn't break. She held Rufus Kane's eyes, and she did not move. He looked away first. It was not dramatic. He simply turned his head and looked at the trail out, the same open sight line he'd come in on, and then he looked at his men, and he said, "We're done here," in the same tone he'd used on the trail. That same giving way, that same revision. He turned his horse. His men turned with him, and the man with the broken nose went last. And before he did, he looked at Martha one more time with an expression that was not quite anything she had a clean word for. Not respect, not exactly, but something adjacent to the recognition that the world contained things he'd failed to account for. Then they rode out through the gate and down the approach, and the sound of them faded into the cold morning air, and the valley went quiet in the way it always went quiet, which was complete and clean and entirely its own. Martha let out a breath that she'd been holding for 7 days. From behind the front window, she heard Henry say quietly, "They're gone." Not triumphant, just stating the fact, confirming it for himself. Peter's voice came from the barn. "All clear up here." A moment later, from the south, Abe's short whistle. All clear. Silas stood on the porch beside her and did not say anything for a long moment. She could see him processing it, the same methodical processing he applied to everything, the world being revised and refiled. "He won't come back," he said finally. "How do you know?" "Because Kane's operations run on the assumption that obstacles can be removed or avoided. We just became something he can't calculate around, a household he can't quantify." He paused. "Men like that need predictable math. We stopped being predictable." She looked at the empty approach, the tire tracks in the snow already being softened by the morning wind. "We stopped being alone," she said. He turned to look at her. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly it." The door behind them opened and Tobias appeared in his nightclothes and his too large coat that he'd apparently pulled on over them, his hair entirely vertical on one side, blinking at the cold morning air with the profound disorientation of someone for whom the world makes only slightly more sense in daylight than in dreams. "Did the bad men come?" he asked. "They did," Silas said. "Did they go away?" "They did." Tobias considered this with the gravity it deserved. Then he looked at the snow-covered valley, the pines, the pink-going gold edge of the sky above the eastern ridge. He watched it for a moment. "It's pretty in the morning," he said. "It is," Silas said. "Can I have breakfast?" "Yes," Martha said. He turned and went back inside. They heard him announce to whoever was in the kitchen that the bad men had come and gone away, and could he please have something to eat. Martha laughed. It came out all the way this time, but not the almost, not the narrowing of the gap, but the real thing, sudden and genuine and slightly undignified. And she laughed for a few seconds on the porch of this house, in this valley, in this cold February morning, and Silas stood beside her and his face did the thing it did, that small settling, except it went further this time. He didn't laugh because she didn't think that was something that arrived easily for him, but something in his face opened in a way she'd been watching happen by degrees over 6 weeks and had not seen arrive fully until now. It looked like relief. Not the relief of a crisis ending, though it was that. The deeper kind. The kind that means, this is real. This is actually happening. This is mine. She understood it because she felt it too. Spring came late that year, the way spring always came late in Crow Valley. Reluctantly, in stages, the snow retreating inch by inch up the hillsides while the valley floor went from white to gray to the tentative green of the first grass pushing through frozen ground. Martha marked its progress from the kitchen window every morning. The same window she'd first looked through in November and thought, this is larger than anything I've lived in. By March, she'd stopped noticing the size of it. By April, it was just the house. The children settled into the ranch the way children settle into things that are good for them. Not smoothly, not without friction, but deeply, the way roots go down. Henry worked with Silas and Abe from early morning to evening and came to the table at night tired in the way of someone who has used himself fully, which was a different tired than the one he'd carried in Red Hollow, lighter somehow, less like a burden and more like the ordinary weight of a day. He didn't say much about it. He didn't need to. Clara finished the history of the Western Territories and started on the veterinary medicine volume, which Silas had not anticipated but found, upon reflection, he couldn't object to. She developed opinions about cattle health that she shared at the dinner table, and Abe, who had 30 years of practical animal knowledge, began responding to her opinions with the specific attention he gave things that were worth responding to, which Clara recognized immediately and treated as the serious engagement it was. The twins discovered that the Valley in Spring was a world-sized project for two boys with more energy than any reasonable pair of humans should have, and they threw themselves into it with the enthusiasm of people who have been given exactly the right amount of space for who they are. They helped Silas repair the east fence they'd taken down. They helped wrong sometimes, in the way of 12-year-olds who are learning, and Silas redirected them with the patient economy of a man who had decided that patience was worth the investment. Annie found a barn cat that was completely feral and had been living in the hayloft for apparently several years without anyone being able to get within 6 feet of it. Annie named it Margaret, placed food outside the loft door every morning, and waited. By late March, Margaret would come to the edge of the loft and watch her. By April, she'd come down 1 step. It was a project of extraordinary patience for a 6-year-old, and Martha watched it happening and thought, she learned this. She already knew how to do this, and now she's applying it. Tobias turned 5 in early April, which was the first birthday they'd had at the ranch, and Peter made a cake that was structurally questionable, but earnestly intended and tasted, improbably, quite good. There were 5 candles and a considerable amount of noise. Silas sat at the end of the table and watched it all with the expression Martha had learned to read, that open thing, that slowly arriving belonging. And she watched him watch it and thought about what he'd said. 6 years alone in this house. 6 years is a long time. It does things to a person that can't be fully undone, the same way grief does things, or poverty does things, or a hard winter does things. You don't come back from it entirely. You come back from it changed, carrying the shape of it, and you build the new life around that shape rather than pretending the shape isn't there. She understood this better than most, which was perhaps why she'd been patient with it. On a morning in early May, when the valley was fully green and the creek had thawed and was running loud over its rocks, in the particular cheerful way of mountain water released from winter, Martha was in the kitchen garden. She'd started it in March, the first thing she'd done that was purely hers on this land, turning the soil in the south-facing bed by the kitchen wall and putting in what she'd salvaged from her Red Hollow seed stores. It was coming up now, irregular and stubborn and hers. She heard Silas come up behind her. She'd learned his footfall. "The south fence is done," he said. He was talking about a section they'd been repairing since the thaw. "I know," she said. "I watched Henry ride out this morning." He stood for a moment. She kept her hands in the soil. "Martha." She looked up. He had something in his hand. She didn't process what it was for a moment because the way he was holding it was so unlike him, slightly uncertain, which was something she had almost never seen from him. It was a ring, plain silver, simple, the kind of thing you'd get from the depot at Garner's Crossing, nothing ornamental. I know we have a contract, he said. I know the legal arrangement is already... He stopped. He tried again. I know that what I'm offering is another stop. He pressed his lips together briefly, which was what he did when he was working through something that didn't have a clean road. I'm not good at this, he said. I know, she said. I want it to be a choice, he said, not a contract. I want you to choose it. He paused. I want to choose it, properly. She looked at him, this difficult, quiet, careful man who had crouched down in front of Tobias in the snow and told him what he was and was not, and who had given 4 connecting rooms to 7 children without making anything of it, and who had read every line of a contract before signing it, and who had sat in a chair in a dark cabin and said, I miss that part most, actually. Someone who argued back. She looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at the garden coming up around her knees, her seeds, her work, her earth now. I already chose it, she said. In November, when I looked at the mountains and said I wasn't afraid of them. That was survival, he said. No, she said. Survival was the platform. The mountains were something else. He held her eyes. I'm not easy to live with, he said. It was a warning and a fact and an apology all at once. I have 7 children and opinions about everything, she said. Neither am I. Something moved across his face. The involuntary thing. The thing that surprised him every time it happened, as if he'd genuinely forgotten he was capable of it. She took the ring from his hand. She put it on herself because that seemed right. Not given, taken, chosen. He looked at her hand. All right, he said. All right, she said. That was all. No ceremony, no grand declaration, nothing that would have looked like much to anyone watching from the outside. Just 2 people in a kitchen garden in May, in a valley tucked between mountains, with 8 other people distributed across the property doing the ordinary work of an ordinary day. But ordinary was what they'd fought for. Ordinary was the whole point. That evening at supper, all 9 of them at the table, Abe and Peter included, because that was how it had become. Because somewhere between November and May, the table had expanded to fit everyone and nobody had formally decided it, and now it simply was. Clara noticed the ring. She noticed it the way Clara noticed everything, which was immediately and without making a production of it. She looked at it, looked at Silas, looked at her mother, and then went back to her food. About time, she said, to her plate. Henry looked up. He looked at Silas. He looked at his mother. Something moved through his 14-year-old face, something complicated and careful and ultimately, quietly, at peace. He nodded once, to Silas, the same nod he'd given on the trail. Silas nodded back. James said, "What's about time?" And Joseph said, "I'll explain later." And Annie said, "Does this mean we stay here forever?" In a tone of such pure, unguarded hope that the table went briefly quiet with the weight of it. "Yes," Martha said, simple as that. Annie exhaled. It was the sound of 6 years old setting something down that had been too heavy for too long. Tobias, who had been focused on his food with the absolute concentration of a 5-year-old who has opinions about supper, looked up at the brief silence and assessed the room. "Is everyone happy?" he asked. Martha looked around the table. This difficult, loud, imperfect collection of people. The ones she'd made and the ones she'd found and the ones she was still figuring out. The cracked ribs and the arguments and the wrong answers about Chapter 7 and the fence that needed redoing and the cat that would only come halfway down the loft stairs and the boy who had carried too much weight and the girl who had learned not to panic and the man who had forgotten how to have someone argue back until someone did. None of it perfect. All of it real. "Yes," she said. "Everyone's happy." Tobias nodded and went back to his food. Outside, the valley did what it did. Held them, kept them, indifferent and enormous and quietly sufficient. The creek ran. The pines stood their long watch. The mountains were exactly where they'd always been. And inside the house, the woman that Red Hollow had looked at and found wanting, too big, too much, too many mouths, sat at the head of a table that was full, in a home that was hers, in a life that she had not been given but had built, piece by stubborn piece, out of every hard thing she had refused to be destroyed by. That was the truest thing about her. It had always been the truest thing. She just needed land enough to show it.
Well, I guess it's over. What the fuck?
It's cooked.
It's cooked! We were right there! Oh my god, man. And that fucking bird just blocked the way through, bro. It fucking whooped my... I jumped in the water and it jumped in after me, bro. They're not supposed to fucking do that. What a fucking little asshole. My god, man. So cooked.
It's alright.
Where's Benjamin?
Dude,
I don't know.
he was right at the switch.
He literally was a millisecond away, bro.
He's playing. He's loading back up.
I can't even invite people. Hold on. I have to fucking... No, wait, he's not even here. Why did I believe him? I'm in a call with Ben. Wait, he left.
Hello?
Ben, what happened?
My computer exploded.
Dude, you were right at the fucking thing. You were the last person, bro. Our run's cooked.
You didn't Alt F4?
No. It's gone. It's over, man.
It's over.
Wait, I think Megan wants to play though. Megan!
Figured I was the last one alive, and as I'm running to the end, my computer just exploded.
Max is here too. We could get Megan and Max.
Again.
Megan can have my spot. Megan! Megan! I cannot tonight. Okay.
Act like a bird.
MEAGAN. I have lots of work to do. Come on, Chud, just get on.
I was literally about to just fucking hit